but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending, Goethe, I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
You're going back to me. Can you?
I just said, no, don't change.
No.
10 books.
You're changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
It's not a book.
Twilight series. It is a book.
Dress your age. Carrying a school bag on stage. What are you doing with a school bag on stage? You can't even read.
Oh, it's good to be back.
Morning, campers.
It's so good to be back. It's been too long.
It really has. It's only been 2 weeks.
I want to start by saying congratulations on the Digital Archipelago coming back as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, all it takes is viewers like you and your money, and anything can come back for a limited time, I guess.
You're going to keep them on edge the entire time. Every episode should be the last
for like
episode.
I think it was like 6 weeks, I started saying, well, like, this was a great way to end the series. It ended on such a high note. What a great way to end it, to mess with people and keep them on edge. You have never read any bloody books, says Machiavelli Sucks to Go. Boy, oh boy, this is why we have the show. God!
He says that like it's a bad thing. You shouldn't read books.
That's why we're here.
How clear must we be?
Don't ruin the bit. We do this show so you don't have to read. We are pro-illiteracy. That's why we're here.
What's the perfect amount of books? Because if you start reading and never stop, that's a gaffe. But if you just read one book, that's even worse. I've known some guys who just read one book and they build their entire lives around that and can't stop referencing it. So both ends of that spectrum are bad. What's a good, like, I want to say 5 to 7. That's enough.
Are we talking fiction or nonfiction?
I don't even see fiction as reading. I see, like, reading should be a solitary, grim, punishing experience. But if you're just reading,
the only time I don't ever find reading fiction to be a punishing experience is when I'm reading dumb shit written by our guys. Like our friend T.R. Hudson has a short story called The Theme Park, and it's literally a theme park where liberals go to beat up and kill Hitler clones. And I'm like, this isn't punishing. This is fine. But you tell me,
I love that premise.
It's a great premise. It's a great story. I find it weird that I'm like, oh, I read this on a Substack, and now it's in like Hard Reset magazine or whatever, but they call themselves Hard R. And I'm like, this is great, but this also has like a really interesting audience problem now, doesn't it?
like no joke, that story sounds like I could see that on TikTok. That would be someone's announcing a new retreat that only women are going on, and then there's video, AI generated or not, of just women paying to beat up Hitler. I bet you could start that in an old abandoned fairgrounds.
In an old abandoned book depository in Dallas, Texas.
Give a bunch of women some foam baseball bats, and then you and the boys can dress up like Hitler. And we were talking about this beforehand. If they're Zoomers, this has got to be part of what that fetish is that they all have, like getting beaten up by women. So everyone wins. I'm fucking smart at business, man. So
we need to invest.
I'm going to need a cool 10% on this one, guys, whoever ends up doing it.
I need $250,000 for investment capital purposes. I want the fascist theme park of every woman's dreams to come real.
For me, I could go for $500,000. I could really go for that right about now.
I'm not asking. $250K now.
I'm so happy that you brought the gun to the podcast, because we were talking beforehand.
It's the talking gun.
He did the talking gun. I'm going to bring it up, but I don't want to blow up his spot.
It's okay. It's okay.
I'm so happy that there's a gun.
I was shopping for firearms by mouthfeel. It was a great time. And if you tell that joke to young people around you, they get really uncomfortable. But I'm like, dude, I just saw you retweet how you want to kill yourself like for the last 6 days in a row. But someone makes a well-timed joke. I guess you're not a texture person. That's what I understand. You're not a texture person.
I want to bring in my just awkward shotgun and just like try and into the mic, but fumble it and blow up the whole nerve.
And then we can do the line. Well, I guess that's it then.
Shoot the shotgun, but then I'm dead silent, and I'm like, "Are we? Let's run with this. Murder, suicide, live on air. Murder, suicided himself, because when it's an accident, it's kind of a murder."
That's once is murder, second is farce.
Oh, we got a comment here, Nathan Hayes. Not once in like 60 episodes has anyone ever told me anything about car insurance. I don't know what that means.
Well, you can save 15% or more on Geico.
Because we also haven't had 60 episodes, have we? No.
No,
of course not.
This is maybe at best, episode 10?
You can't be asking anyone in this space about car insurance, by the way. Like any type of insurance, everyone's going to give you some extreme or another. Like everyone gets libertarian when it comes to car insurance. Everyone's going to say, just don't pay, just don't get it, just don't pay it. If someone asks you for it, shoot them and say you're a sovereign citizen.
That movement's wild, by the way. I'm glad that I think Gio and I covered a documentary about it a few months back. And it's and it was Canadian.
I think because that was.
I think you were on that episode.
That might have been that wasn't the last one, but it was like the second to last one. No, it wasn't the last
one. It was the second to last one. But it was such a wild ride because it was like maritime law. That's why none of the Canadian flags are on the ground or whatever. Like, and in America, it's even more wild because it's just like guys driving with no driver's license or just a little paper that says I do what I want. It's a fun time.
What I love about the sovereign citizen movement, because I understand it and I'm impressed by the amount of legal knowledge required to just participate in this, but it's been going on for so long. I have to ask, has this ever worked? And I mean, has any confrontation ever gone their way? Really? And I guess the one example we have was that documentary we did on Digital Archipelago, where I think you can just frustrate the sheriff enough that they leave you alone. But like if you're pulled over,
I'm literally Googling federal court cases involving sovereign citizens because I want to know, have they ever succeeded?
Can I just go to court and say nah?
Federal courts have seen a wide variety of cases involving individuals identifying sovereign citizens, often related for tax evasion, frauds, and attempts to challenge legal authority. But no, I want actual like court cases. Is what I want.
Has anyone thought of going into court with their eyes closed?
And there we go. List of all U.S. court cases where a sovereign citizen argument's been ruled against. All of them. A 1990 Supreme Court decision, the U.S. v. Schneider, contains a reference to the sovereign citizen arguments being null and void. If you search the court rule, now I guess I'm going to go on my cracked copy of LexisNexis or with my not so legit credentials and go check that out.
We're like the last people on the internet who are looking into the sovereign citizen movement. That really died on the vine, but.
I feel like, you know how I know it died on the vine is when like normie YouTubers decided to cover it. Like the moment Wendigoon decided to cover sovereign citizens, that's when you know it was over. Like any political intelligentsia behind any concept of sovereign citizens, they're like, hey, this like baby-faced Mexican kid did a whole like 4-hour documentary on us and made us look like idiots. I think it's kind of over.
You know, I wanted to get into making content like that under a different name, a different title. I don't know if you've ever heard of that career, like Nexpo or something.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very serious and moody reviews of like creepy pasta and pretending it's real, right? And I wanted to do that.
I'm your host, $50.
Yeah.
Keep with the currency.
I'm your host. 25 cents. What's that called? Nothing. But yeah, I want to do that just for our bullshit, our lore on the side, and make like an hour-long documentary about.
Could you imagine like a
Chris
2.5 hour long documentary on the rise and fall of Campbot?
Oh yes. And I
want a sequel to that Feel When No GF, that's what I want.
The rise and frustrating plateau of Logo Daedalus. I would watch that for an hour and a half.
And it would just be like the thumbnail would be him like barely raising his hand when he's at that Caleb Maupin, communist thing or whatever that he tended to. Like he was trying so hard not to be seen. That was really entertaining.
I don't like him at all, and I hate him so much. I want to become his biggest fan. Like I want to.
He has good. Yeah, I will say this. I like his literature takes.
Yeah,
He has
but
some great literature takes. Outside of that, his cinephilia is an instant turnoff.
Like I look at him and I say, I want to take some time off, and I want to teach you Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I want you to be able to kick my ass. And I want that to happen, and just to see someone that looks like him just beat the shit out of me.
Just the Giga Chat with the flashlight, and it's just like ripped and ready to kill Logo Daedalus.
Have you ever hated someone so much you want them to kill you? That's where I'm at.
Oh, that's a great way to blow 10 minutes of the show real quick. It's a fun time.
That's a great way to blow the confidence and the good faith of our audience. But
skip to around 11:35 for those that made it this far.
Also, which is what we're at. Oh, you know what? We'll get started now. Let's get started. Let's get it in this book.
There you go.
Before I'm going to get into the weeds on something or other, and that's the last thing we need tonight.
Well, there's a lot of weeds to get into because we are going to, Lord willing, complete the second half of Christianity and Classical Culture, a study of thought and action from Augustus to Augustine by Charles Norris Cochrane, published 1950, right?
I believe so, yeah. I'm just getting this.
No, 1940, Oxford University Press. Look at that.
Fancy that. Here we go. We got it up on screen. And of course, we're working with different editions of this book, different PDFs. So we might be calling to the wrong page number as we're doing this, but I'm going to endeavor to have the correct readings up on screen and also references throughout. So I don't need to say, tell the folks at home who St. Augustine is.
Tell the folks that, well, if you're anyone familiar of, say, the City of God on Christian Doctrine or St. Ambrose of Milan, no, I mean, St. Augustine or just Augustine, depending on how you want to attribute to him, is probably one of the most prolific and most influential writers in Western Christendom specifically, and we're going to go through a lot of City of God later. But no, St. Augustine of Hippo, where you might get St. Augustine, Florida from, or St. Augustine grass, but I won't go into that. We'll just go with St. Augustine of Hippo for today. Theologian and a philosopher of Berber origin, born roughly around 354 AD, dies 430, was the bishop of Hippo Regius in Roman North Africa. You can read quite a bit on his work of the City of God, on Christian Doctrine, Confessions, but he also wrote quite a bit even before he was baptized into the faith. You can read things about Against the Philosophers, on how to read a happy life, and quite a bit of stuff there. But his work is so influential that he is still cited today, even if you aren't a believer in communion with the saints. Numerous Protestants like to cite him as well.
Yeah, and I haven't read nearly as much of him as I should because I'm a Catholic, and I'm going to do a joke.
He's like your top guy outside of Thomas Aquinas.
I'm going to do a very tired joke that I always do, but it's ripe for the plucking. We'll read anything except the Bible. So all the theologians, hey, we love, all of our saints and everything. Yeah, he features very prominently in the section of the book that we are going to be covering. And just to recap where we went, I think the first episode really framed the discussion in what, the thrust of this was what inspired the shift from Hellenism to Christianity. It wasn't necessarily a viral incursion as some people like to portray it as, and we're going to get a bit more into that during this episode, especially with Julian the Apostate. But it was just explaining how that shift occurred, what reasons behind the shift were present, what questions were not being answered by the old ways, the ancient ways, and why there was a thirst that must be slaked by a new higher order way of thinking, even as it was dragging much of that culture up and along with it. And that's, I believe, one important aspect that we're going to get to today. The first episode, our first coverage of this, we only really got halfway through. And even when I covered it on the show, that's about where I got to. There's a lot more interesting stuff that happens at the end, a lot more, I would say...
The second half of this book is so good.
Yeah, and I would say...
The first half leaves you really frustrated because the first half of this book, which is really all it's in 3 sections: reconstruction, renovation, and regeneration. The first section of the book really dives into like the mind of Roman religion, what Cochrane calls classical thought, pre-Christian thought, and the way to look at the world, relying heavily on Hellenized forms of paganism, as well as Platonism, later on Neoplatonism, but also at the same time, sort of this Romanatus, this idea of what it means to be Roman, this sort of Roman civic religion. Not only do you pay tribute to the gods, but also that Rome is this, as Crassus had said quite famously, that Rome is a city that is in the eternal thoughts and the mind of God. And that's there present. And it's so the religious and the metaphysical value of a person's life and being in existence is tied to the prosperity of the empire. So Roma Eterna. However, this kind of has its problems as we enter the crisis of the 3rd century. We have these outside religions, Judaism, Hellenized Judaism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism later, and other belief systems kind of clashing, especially not only just from the East, but also dealing with the religious traditions of the Gauls and the Germanic tribes that they had been dealing with in the frontier. What frustrates me the most about that entire section is that we get like a short paragraph on Diocletian, and then we jump straight to the Edict of Milan. And it's incredibly frustrating for a book that's trying to compare, contrast, and understand the synchronicities as well as syncretism between classical thought, classical philosophy, and the Christian understanding of the world. And there is no mention at all of, St. Justin Martyr, Athenagoras of Athens, or even, Pliny or Livy writing to other Roman emperors throughout antiquity about what the hell did we do with these Christians. And so the first half of this book is really frustrating because it's like, well, there's a lot of early interactions between pagans and Christians. Like Celsus gets mentioned quite a bit in this book, but we actually don't see Celsus explicitly quoted very much at all. And I know not a lot of his work still survives outside of Contra Celsus, written by Christian apologists, in the same way that Against the Galileans by Julian the Apostate. We have only fragments that survive. We have quite a bit of it still there, but that gets quoted extensively. And it's just frustrating because it's like, well, if we're trying to understand how these things came to be in the context of a Roman system of government, the empire, trying to reformulate, this sort of civitas, the public sector, the private religion, the church and the state, the things that we kind of know today, especially in Western philosophy and Western legal thought, that there's not a lot of direct clashes early on. And instead, we kind of get the biggest amount of this we actually get comes from the successors to Emperor Constantine. And there's a whole really great chapter on Julian the Apostate, which is really good. And so I think that might be a good place to start, because I think that his arguments against the religion are interesting, but I think to me what makes it far more interesting when reading about the life of Julian is the way he governed. And for a guy who was kind of sent off to die in Gaul fighting against the Germanic tribes, not only does he succeed, he overthrows Constantius and takes on the imperial purple once again. And the way that he starts going against his enemies is stuff that still gets practiced to this day politically. And it's a really good chapter.
That's fascinating. And also, before we go on, I need to call attention to this super chat from Hamburgini Mercy. Says, looks like y'all take my filthy lucre here, lads. I'm apparently debanked in Canada until the day of the rake. I'm sad to hear that. It happens quite a bit up here.
But I'm happy for the money. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you so much. Anyone who wants to send. Oh, we got another one. 10 up here. Prude frog emoji.
That's
there we
it.
go.
I take it.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
I love a nice, succinct super chat like that.
It's great.
So yeah, we can just jump right in with Julian the Apostate. I had a segment here from page 264 where I'm looking at right now.
Okay.
And I guess I'll just jump into it. It says, and as I was reading this, you had pointed out that Christianity was but one incursion religiously from the East, and I loved. One thing I noticed was that hearing Julian's criticisms of Christianity, it sounded very familiar. And we'll get into that with the segment I want to read right now. But a lot of his criticisms echo what some people in our sectors are saying about it right now. But even cutting a bit deeper into what the Christian conceptualization of the one was, rather than just saying it's Jewish, because that's what you hear people say, like, that's a Jewish thing coming over here. I found his criticisms were deeper than you would expect, but it was still of that same style, which was that, like, this is a foreign thing and we must be rid of it. It says here, the views which Julian entertained of Christianity were largely colored by his impression of Constantine. From this standpoint, the advent of Christianity, so far from heralding a new dawn for mankind, represented merely the latest phase in an endless conflict between civilization and barbarism. Accordingly, he everywhere opposes characteristic examples of Jewish wisdom to their Greco-Roman counterparts and asserts that, by comparison with the immense achievements of the Romatas, the record of the Hebrews is contemptible. So interesting couple lines there. If history proves anything, it's that the Jews are a God-forsaken race and not, as they imagine, the special favorites of the deity. They have shown themselves deficient in general enlightenment, and their story has been one of successive captivities. In this spirit, Julian draws up a more or less comprehensive indictment of the Christian faith. He begins by denying the divinity of the Master as a fable which appeals only to the part of the soul which is childish, silly, and credulous. So, you know, the criticism of the Master, yes, but also saying, this seems Jewish to me, and these Jews they suck, and I don't like them. Would that be a fair assessment of his criticisms there?
A good chunk of it, but also we have to understand that he's also incredibly well versed in Christianity. He is raised as a Christian early on. He is taught extensively by a well-learned bishop who would later be taken away for sort of his Arian beliefs, George of Cappadocia, who tried his best, despite George being excommunicated, defrocked, and sent into exile. He tried very hard to ensure that he got a hold of his library. If there's one thing that we can give definite credit to for Julian is that he's an incredibly well-read man. He is definitely a scholar as well as a military leader. And so he's also definitely jarred by, one, the laws that Constantine puts in place, and by extension, a lot of the things that are followed on by Constantius, who is not an effective emperor or really any sort of administrator whatsoever. And so these, belief systems in which there's this public Christianity. However, Constantius, so those who are familiar with church history, is definitely trying to push a more Arianized Christianity rather than what we would call little o or just Nicene Christianity for little o orthodoxy. And so he's got to deal with these people that have finally just emerged as a legal state religion that have been pushing for, under Constantine and Constantius, to punish the old ways and to ban things. There's a Lord's Day Act that Constantine implements for Sundays. And then later on, as we get into the history of the church under the Roman Empire, a lot of it becomes more expansive. For Julian, he sees that this is nothing more but foreign subversion. And he sees this also as taking away from, as the classic sort of claim that you might hear against Christianity about, like, this is taking away from the natural ways of order of, might makes right. Julian famously writes this sort of satirical, it's not really a play, but it's definitely a satire called The Caesars. And for him, the person who meets this ultimate definition of a man who has been sanctified in Julian's worldview is Marcus Aurelius, and not, say, Constantine, Constantius, or others. And some of them get close, others not so much. And he mocks the sacrament of baptism and mocks Christ as this seducer, saying, like, listen, if you come unto me, if you were to be baptized, then the evils that you have done have been washed away, although I know that you're going to still do it. And he portrays Constantine as someone who falls for this. But what makes it more interesting, and Cochrane doesn't get into things. I mean, he mentions Julian's inevitable campaign in Mesopotamia against the Persians and his death. It's very minor. He doesn't mention anything about what goes on in his attempts to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. That's a whole other wild story that has multiple sources, both by Christian as well as non-Christian historians, of all the weird shit that happens as Julian tries to rebuild it. And at the same time, while he mocks the Jews, he uses the Jews as a leverage against the Christians, and kind of offering this Marcionite style of criticism, saying, like, well, obviously the traditions of the Galileans are not anything at all like the traditions of the Jews. And if anything, this should just be a local Galilean cult and not this religion, because it seems so backwards compared to the greatness of the Greco-Roman tradition and the history of Roman gods that have been so part of us. And as he takes control, this is where I find his ability to govern to be particularly interesting, in part because for Julian, it's, well, how do I take advantage of the public system? How do I ensure that, Christianity, which had just recently enjoyed being sort of this public imperial office, doesn't get the same benefits as they once did. So it's slowly taking away Christian clerics, bishops, these legal protections that these people have, by kind of slowly squeezing on them things regarding inheritance of property, the strength of the ecclesiastical courts when it comes to charges against bishops and priests and other clergymen of all orders. But the thing that he also does is that if you want to be part of the public education system or to hold office, anyone who wants to be holding office in Julian's empire is to be well read on the classics of his time that are all pagan in nature. And he basically says, in this sort of nice way of framing the religion, well, considering that, this is blasphemy to you people, then, Christians shouldn't be reading these books. And in fact, we'll be banning Christians from doing that. You can go study the Evangel, the Gospels in your own respective seminaries or whatever, but you're not really going to be holding any sort of clerical or bureaucratic office in that way. So you're using the education system to filter certain people out so they can't hold these positions of power or be involved in clerical positions in running the empire. That way, you're effectively ghettoizing Christianity from the public sector, which is something we still see to this day when it comes to education and training for in our respective governments. And
I was about to say, there's strong echoes of this in the modern day.
Well, I mean, that's the thing about good politics, is that it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's gonna be there itself.
What if the real Rome has been around us the entire time? What if we're in Rome and it just sucks?
That would be terrifying. That would be terrifying.
There's a segment here that speaks to everything you had just said, that I found very interesting, especially the jostling to further Christianity away from the civic religion. It says here on page, hold on, let me pull it up here to make sure I got this right.
Sure.
284.
It's also important to note while he's looking for this that Cochrane characterizes this, ironically, as sort of a cultural fight over for secularism. I'm just to quote this section here before you get to it. He says, innovation, Julian declares, I abominate above all things, especially as concerns the gods, and I hold that we ought to maintain intact the laws that which we have inherited from the past, since it is evident that they are God-given. In this spirit, he undertook to disestablish and, if possible, destroy the Constantinian Church. But in his dealings alike with individual Christians in the Church as an ecclesiastical body, it is not too much to say that by repudiating as barbarous the harsh, indiscriminate methods of his cousin, he introduced a new phase of the secular conflict between Christianity and classicism. In this phase, the main assault was directed not so much against individual believers as against the ecclesiastical corporation, regarded as the chief instrument of intellectual and moral corruption, the chief obstacle to the reassertion of social justice and social peace under the old order.
That's a great segment, and that bleeds right into what this one is on page 284 here. It says, it has been suggested that in the idea of grafting a fruitful church life upon the stock of paganism is to be found Julian's best claim to originality, if not to greatness, and furthermore that the notion was borrowed from Christianity. We may agree that Julian shared with Constantine a sense of the need for a state religion, without for a moment admitting that he had to go to Constantine for the idea. Accordingly, as between Julian and Constantine, the question was, if a state religion, why not Hellenism, the religion of good citizenship rather than bad? The problem was to present Platonic solar monotheism as the foundation for a cult of civilization capable of unifying and vitalizing Romanitus, while at the same time offering a fresh sanction to local and national loyalties within the larger whole. It involved, among other features, a general restoration of the temples and images, the material representations through which Julian saw a popular way to access the Most High God. And I'm trying to remember where I saw this spoken of before. I want to say it was not Wilfred Bion. It was Harold A. Ennis in Empire and Communication, I think. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you're thinking of exactly what I'm thinking of, but there was descriptions of attempting to create just this general, almost, corporate Memphis version of a sun god. Like, they just made it up. They said, oh, they like you like this god. How about we have we'll make our version of that to make everyone happy. And it just didn't take. And it continues on here. As Pontifex Maximus, he drew upon the ancient Roman legacy for authority to organize and direct the imperial cult, as well as to admonish or rebuke its ministers. His failure, however, cannot be ascribed merely to the fact that the materialists were deaf to his message, for it contained no real appeal to old-fashioned humanists such as Amanius. And among the Christians, there were few serious thinkers whom he could hope to seduce from the faith. And so to me, it sounds like he was, as I said, creating this new interesting state religion that borrowed very ill-fittingly from what was around it and just didn't take. What's your read on that? Is that correct?
Yeah, partially. I mean, like as Cochrane notes, what Julian is trying to do, and I've read some biographical stuff on Julian. He borrows from a French writer, I think the last name's Duquesne, on the life of Emperor Julian, but it's written in French. I don't have a copy of that. I did watch some documentary stuff on him just because I was fascinated with him as a military leader more than I was interested in the apostate stuff, just because I have the church's historical tradition and record on that issue. But
it sounds like the apostate part is highly editorializing this man. Is he known as just Julian, or is it usually with the apostate appendage?
Well, I think it's kind of fallen out of favor just as the academy's become more secularized. I mean, most people would know him as the apostate, but also just as Emperor Julian. And I'm sure he's got other titles as well. But I mean, he is Pontifex Maximus as well. He's holding on to an older title that has been around since the times of Caesar. But he is sort of trying to create I don't want to say a new religion, but also that there is this supreme heavenly father creator figure, not really the heavenly father that you and I would recognize or identify, but that there is the supreme creator, but also that he is accessible through these other deities that the peoples worship. And in fact, in one of his letters, he says, I wish that all can be included under this system. It's only a matter of Jehovah wanting to come on board and join this sort of pantheon, or so to speak, trying to incorporate the peace in doing so. But yeah, I also had the same thing that you were reading incorporated in my notes. So for instance, when talking about classical literature or the liberal arts, as we know, any sort of prohibition of Christianity or Christians to be part of the liberal studies they saw as an imperial policy that would have presently rendered the faith, in fact, that Julian so persistently asserted it to be, the mere continuation of a semi-barbarous cult bounded by the narrow confines of Galilee, and this way destroying the significance of the evangel or the gospel as the culmination of preparatio, which embraced the total spiritual experience of mankind. Accordingly, they joined issue with the apostate in a fiercely contested battle of the books, which ought to be the battle of the books, which was only to be concluded with Julian's death. It was perhaps fortunate for his enemies that the logic of Julian's position was, within a measurable time, to bring about that consummation of their hopes. As we have noted, it was essential to Julian's repudiation of Constantinianism that he has rejected the philo-barbarian policy of his uncle. On the northern frontier, this meant a cessation of those humiliating subsidies that drained the resources of municipalities, served merely to inflate the pride and rapacity of its recipients. In the east, it meant a revival of the traditional military glories of the Romanatus through the chastisement of the Persian king. But the project, which was thus designed to restore the republic, would end in ruin. But that's a whole other discussion with regards to his military campaign in Persia. But like, again, we're seeing we have to keep these people out of the schools. We have to keep these people from attaining education. We have to stop giving them the subsidized position that Constantine and Constantius continued, of giving them these sort of subsidized posts. They can't take advantage duty-free of the imperial system or its service. And we can definitely define Julian as a reactionary to ongoing social changes. And he's really wanting to sail Greco-Roman paganism under this sort of, what's the word? There's a term for it. It's not monotheism, but it's when like you claim that there is one supreme deity, but there's also represented throughout all these other sort of deities and local deities. I think it starts with an H. I don't know the term off the top of my head. That's what he's trying to institute alongside.
Yeah, I don't know the name for it, but I've seen people advocate for that even now.
Yeah. And so, you've got a guy who's trying to keep things balanced because he still does have to deal with this Christian institution that he despises. But at the same time, he's trying to push forward the Platonic Roman Hellenist, paganism that we know.
Wifa here says henotheism.
Thank you. I knew it started with an H. Henotheism. Yeah, I mean, that's really what he's pushing for. Because, like, there is this acknowledgement of this creator, but also at the same time, we have these other gods in which we can entreat to know him.
It's very utilitarian. It's very pragmatic. It's saying that we need a system. Let us create a system that appeals to all these phenomena that we are seeing and try and. It seems like something a state would do, and that's why you have the populist side. This could be seen as, if you'd like to frame it this way, as the elite theory response to it versus the populist revolt that you were seeing within the Christian movement. And I wanted to ask you, because you go much deeper on the life of Julian than I do, just to summarize what's not included in the book. Would you say that he's an interesting figure? He's cast as a villain partially in this book, or in a not too, charitable light. But what's your assessment of Julian's reign, and was he known for some good things too?
As a brilliant, well, until his campaign towards Persia. But I mean, dealing with the Germanic tribes when he was sent over there, not only does he, establish himself as a very competent military commander, but also as an excellent politician. Because under the system at the time, you sort of have like big C Caesar, and then these like little guys that are lower ranking positions that are meant to keep, that are meant to govern in other areas, but still answer to him. And so you have these letters that he gives to Constantius, where he pays sort of credit to Constantius's character, but at the same time, he fucking hates the guy, and Constantius is not a very good emperor in comparison to, say, Constantine or previous emperors beforehand. And so for him, Julian is this excellent political leader that has managed to successfully take power, and then to begin to govern with pretty effective authority, and slowly trying to use the tools available at his power to squeeze out his enemies from gaining any further positions. And of course, a lot of this dies, of course, in the Battle of Mursa, and dying at the hands of the Persians, just like other Roman emperors had done so before in the past. But even while he's there, I mean, it's just sort of funny to me. So he kind of goes. He's in Antioch, and for those who know their book, The Acts of the Apostles, Antioch is the city where we get the name Christians from. And so, he's there, and the Christians kind of make this plurality majority, kind of like around maybe half, maybe 45% of the city. And even they are like, we don't want to really deal with you. And they kind of mock him for his appearance, to where he writes this little satire of himself about having this beard that he thinks is meant to make him look astute and intelligent. And if you want to have a good time, go enjoy reading his work. There's quite a bit of it that we still have preserved in letters and in writing. His criticisms of Christianity, his satires of Constantine and of Christ. But nevertheless, in regards to this section, it's still the end of sort of like attempts to overthrow the Roman Church or the imperial Christian Church at the time. It doesn't really come to an end until maybe Emperor Theodosius, when there's far more of an attempt to govern as a Christian political leader. But for me, apostasy and reaction is a particularly great chapter in this book, just because you have so much political stuff at play here, where being able to take advantage of previous existing laws like toleration in order to eventually get people back on the track that he wants to be, and eventually try and promote things and take political power away from my enemies and try and bring back the sacrifices, the temples, the images, the incense, all of these things. Because for him, this is the way in which I can effectively govern. I don't need this religion that I find to be subversive, foreign, or the antithesis to my ideal system, and which makes him even more dangerous to Christians because he's well read on the scriptures. You can read what existing translations we have of against the Galileans, and a lot of these criticisms, one, are ripped straight from Celsus, and two, are stuff that you'll still get here argue today, even though I think St. Cyril does a pretty good job responding to him. But again, it illustrates how much of an influence that he has, and I can see why people like Alex Petkus and others have kind of made some similar comparisons of Julian's time to today.
Yeah, I found myself, I won't say I identified with his arguments, but I understood them, and I thought the points that he were making were very, as you had said, he was informed by being brought up within the Christian context. He had a deep understanding of it. And this is probably a bad example to give, but I was reminded of a figure named William Gailey Simpson, who I'm not sure if I brought up in the last episode. By the way, if it sounds like there's gunshots in the background, this is Canada Day Eve right now. So people are setting off fireworks, and there's also a thunderstorm that's supposed to be
there's
blowing
also
in.
a thunderstorm near me. So
Yeah.
if you're hearing stuff, it's also up my background. And then of course, I'm glad we're doing it on the 30th and not tomorrow or our Independence Day, because man, nothing would get done.
Yeah. What I was saying was I was reminded of William Gailey Simpson, who wrote the book Which Way, Western Man, which is a book a title that's
a wild read. I don't know how many of the audience have read it. I know that you and I have.
Yeah, it's very long, and he wrote another very substantial work that was more his autobiography, although this has a lot of his autobiography in it. He was affiliated with William Luther Pierce and the National Alliance, but his story, he became a Nietzschean. However, for most of his adult life, he lived what he called a Franciscan life. So for people who don't know, he was a modern day monk. He lived in poverty by choice, did not take a salary, did not take a wage, and would travel around doing good works for free, trying to live as he believed Christ did. And he did this for quite some time. And at some point, the details escape me, but he spent a period of study in a cabin gifted to him by a friend, and he started getting into Nietzsche, started getting into German philosophy, and then he ended up rebuking his entire previous Christian identity and became a Nietzschean, became will to power type guy, and in fact spent the majority of the book arguing against Christianity. And so he could do that, in my opinion. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I found that he could do that more effectively, or at least I believed his words more because he had such an intimate knowledge of it versus just some apathetic atheist who's kind of cherry picking gotchas and stuff. Now, this was a true believer who possessed more tools with which to dismantle it or whatever he was trying to do to it. And so I think that's why I appreciated Julian's. I keep saying it can't be Julian. That's just my Trailer Park Boys poison brain getting in here. I'm always going to say, is it Juliantius? No, it's Julian. There's this one part here that I think summarizes it, and it was his conflict with monasticism. And
I was just about to go there, so go on.
Yeah, and how his criticism of it was more philosophical. And that's what, when we're speaking of his ideas or criticisms that I thought resonated, this is one of them. He says, notwithstanding its vogue in the 4th century, monasticism remained a somewhat unusual manifestation of Christian life. Largely spontaneous in origin and character, the movement appealed mainly to persons of acute sensibility and peculiar temper, and although favorably regarded by churchmen like Athanasius, it was still largely beyond the control of ecclesiastical authority. In this sense, there was some truth in Julian's charge that the monks were the cynics of the Christian world. Nevertheless, there was one characteristic shared alike by monks and ordinary Christians who, without any aspiration to perfection, submitted themselves to the teaching and discipline of the church. This was their common repudiation of reason, of knowledge of the world as a means to self-knowledge, the hard intellectual core which had given character and consistency to classical life. And to Julian, the rejection of reason meant the rejection of all objective standards for life based on the purely subjective forces of impulse, emotion, and sentiment. And I just wanted to connect that to a thought that we had established in the first part of this, which was that you can understand where they're coming from when this thing called Christian faith is of another world. It's directed almost singularly to the hereafter, to the realm outside of this life, whereas the classical world, the ancient world, the Hellenist world, was much more focused on nature, arguably more scientific. And what Christianity represented to them, at least, was a rejection of that. It doesn't care about worldly things. It doesn't care. It sees nature. It sees the entire material world, our realm, as subservient to this higher realm. And so what he saw there was faith as a rejection of reason itself. And that transition was interesting to me because the Christianity that we all understand now seems to have abandoned that fixation on the other world and has turned inward to try and dissect this world. There has been a sort of scientification of Christianity, in my view, and this was explained in depth in the book, The Disenchantment of the World by Marcel Gauchet, which is that we subjected Christianity, us, in what you might call the West, but we might also call Europe, we subjected Christianity to our own scientism. We dissected it. We tried to rationalize Christianity. I think we succeeded, but we severed or made extremely distant our connection to the what you might call the paranormal realm, which is what every ancient person inhabited. There was no demarcation in these people's minds between the paranormal world and the real world. It was totally immersive. And then you start to see this segmentation. I think that segmentation actually takes a leap here by saying there are these different worlds. It's not just intertwined like that. And I think Julian was correct to see that as a threat.
Yeah, and not to mention that he's got the perfect opportunity to do so because Constantius is more favorable towards an Arianized Christianity. And for those unfamiliar with Christian heresies, Arianism is the concept that Christ is a created being and not the eternally begotten of the same substance of God the Father. And I referenced this book last episode called Russia and the Universal Church. And the author makes a really good point in which the reason why, and this is sort of inter-Eastern Western sort of fighting about who's been more, heretical or who's been more doctrinally correct. But the reason why you see a lot of Eastern emperors from Constantius to the end of the Roman or to the Byzantine Empire, have these greater favorabilities towards these heretical components is because the moment that you detach Christ and the Christian understanding of Christ, little o Orthodox Christian understanding of Christ, that you've reduced Christ to a man on a pantheon. You've reduced God to something that is distant. Because if God did not come down to become incarnate, and thus to save mankind from their sins, then all of a sudden, earthly temporal power once again matters more. And I've now divorced the general body politic from the hereafter, or to take no care for tomorrow will, worry unto itself. Now we can focus on temporal power, imperial power. And as Constantius is pushing and fighting with the church, the pre-schism, very early Constantinian church, now all of a sudden Julian's just like, oh, well, they're fighting amongst themselves. There's these problems politically with the legal system, the money, the revenue, the taxes, the subsidies. I can come in. And after Constantius is deposed, he has sort of this advantage to really put into it, because now he's got this ability to say, listen, this system that Constantine put in, look at the short amount of time it's been legalized, has this authority. Clearly, this is not the way to go. And in fact, as Cochrane notes, the restoration of paganism on a formal level will be the basis of a rehabilitated polis, a body politic, in which the sentiment of religion would find its natural expression as a function of an organized political life. The movement was in general form revelation to reason. That is to say, it marked a return to the spirit and method of the classical sciences, which we have elsewhere tried to describe. What it thus presupposed as the condition of wisdom was not the rebirth of the spirit, but rather the sharpened perceptions, making possible a knowledge of nature or of the physical world. Over and above all this, however, it contained elements which were distinctively Platonic. We have seen now within the classical tradition, there were many who were agnostic within the classical traditions. There were many who were agnostic in their physics, or who, in their critical examination of the instrument of knowledge, had come to distrust the validity of its finding. As a consequence, such persons had either fallen into complete skepticism, and they had stopped short with a humanism like that of Cicero. Julian, however, accepted without reserve the claims of Platonism and discovered in there the ideas of a veritable objectivity and universality for which men crave. To him, the problem was merely to apprehend these ideas and clue to a true and final science of nature and of man. Hence his attempt to have this sort of henotheistic, structured religion, kind of to replace the infrastructure of the Christian church.
Now, that's all I really had on Julian. I think we could segue right into Augustine, if you were prepared for that. Was there anything else on Julian that you wanted to discuss?
Not particularly. I think that this chapter is really good. I would really recommend it. There's also, of course, that emphasis on this, like, Helios, the sun god. We're also borrowing things from Mithraism and other forms of paganism at the time. But
yeah, there's this great book I read, and I forgive me if I mentioned it last episode, but it was called Heirs to Forgotten Kingdoms. It's sort of a paperback history book written by, I believe, an archaeologist these guys are all libs, right? But that's fine. He was studying these, we call them cults, I guess, but you call them these ancient religions, these pre-Christian religions, like Mithras and Zoroastrianism. And he was going all throughout the Middle East, specifically Iraq and Iran, seeing like what's happening to them. What's happening to them in the world of Islamism, right? Because Islamism is seeking out these pre-Christian forms, these pre-Islamic forms, and trying to either absorb or destroy them. But my God, I didn't know too much about Zoroastrianism or Mithraism, but I believe, and this does sound like something I mentioned before, so I apologize, but I think it was within Mithras, their god is like a giant flaming peacock demon. Like when they actually describe, because they describe
you're describing Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism, that's what it was. But yeah, it's like literally a giant flaming screaming peacock demon. And I'm like, you could understand why, if presented with that, then you hear about this more higher order God, why that would be seductive. Because at a certain point, if you're contrasting these against each other, the giant screaming flaming peacock demon seems kind of silly. It seems like it can't get the job done. It can't answer all your questions. It doesn't know the answers, right? But he's just going around to these places, these tribes, and just interviewing them and listening to what's happening to them. And there's, I mean, Christ, some of these are maybe 1,000 people strong. They're like these little pockets scattered throughout, and eventually they're going to be gone. And it's not even necessarily by the sword. It's just because they're dwindling. The only people who give a shit are old men, and then the kids run off. Say it's modernity, I guess, but it's wild that they clung on for that long. Anyway, that just reminded me of them borrowing from these, because these would have been present at the time. These would have been in the mix in the culture, and trying to say, like, yeah, let's have some peacock in there too. Let's have some. Who's their guy? A giant baby with huge hands. Let's get some of that in there. Get it in there. We're getting a new pantheon of all the psychos. And a giant sun man at the center. I hope there's
certainly one way to look at it.
I hope there's no Mithras followers in the chat. The last thing I need is heat from the Zoroastrians.
I don't know how many Persians we have in the audience, but I guess we'll find out on.
I know a few. Honestly, in this scene, they're all over the place. They don't reveal.
Well, that is sort of the thing about this scene. Is sort of a meta commentary, like the sort of niche versions of certain beliefs, pagan, Christian, or otherwise, tend to overrepresent themselves on these side of things. You know, like you're a Catholic. You've described yourself as a Catholic weekend warrior. I am a guy who goes to an Orthodox church like 3 days of. Maybe 4 days a week, depending on what I'm singing in or serving in. And I've been, I converted like 5 years ago at this point. So it's just like, yeah, we kind of overrepresent ourselves. So yeah, maybe there are some Zoroastrians in chat. I wouldn't be surprised.
Just some Zoroastrians mauling, seething, cannot reveal themselves, of course. We got an interesting comment here from Rotten Meat. It says, you guys need to focus on the Christian rejection of reason. I don't think most people can grok it. One thing I would respond to that with, and I said it when I was just going on that diatribe a minute ago, was I think people struggle to grok it because it's from a faraway time. When you describe, we've discussed this very frequently on our show, Blood Satellite, and many others have as well, but the way the ancient mind was immersed in religion is completely alien. It's an extraterrestrial experience to most people because, one thing we've always said is that the criticism of the traditionalists and the perennialists is accurate when they say that everyone, even the rebels against modernity, are still trapped within the liberal Enlightenment context, which means you can never remove yourself and transplant yourself into how these people saw the world. So to say that, faith used to counter reason is perplexing to a lot of people, because how can these things be at odds? Is faith not a rational thing? If you were to ask people online, ask any of your friends, I bet they would say that faith is completely rational. But in this book from Cochrane, and I believe this to be the case across time, that faith was seen as the counter to reason. Reason was of this world, but faith was supposed to be outside of that. It's supposed to be, and that was the whole idea of monasticism. You surrender your possessions, you remove yourself from the physical world, you dedicate yourself to this one simple thought process, and that's it. And that would have been highly peculiar, as he says, and very rebellious. But that's why I bring it up, that the true manifestation of that revolution was in monasticism, even though most people don't do that, but that is like a pure faith. And I think only and this will sound kind of extreme, I think only the most extreme people would engage in that now, as we saw with William Gailey Simpson, to do a heel turn like that, to be the most Christian possible, and then later in life to become the most anti-Christian possible, is a wild heel turn that most people don't do. I think you need to have a certain character to even do that. Anyway, I'm just getting off the weeds on that.
The other thing too that on that, I guess on that point is that also consider, I mean, if you ever want to crack open your New Testament for a minute, go read some of the things that like Christ commands his followers to do. And I'm not just talking about the disciples. I'm just talking about, the believers in general, the faithful of today. Goes very much against the logical reason or belief that you would see to this day. And for Julian and for critics, it's going to be that kind of deal. This is that, to sell all your things and to follow me. Julian had said, well, if everyone in the empire had done that, like the empire ceases to exist. That's insane. In the same way that St. Athanasius points out when it comes to monasticism, like this is also a new thing that kind of emerges out of older Jewish traditions in North Africa and in Syria and in Palestine that are Christianized and become their own thing kind of outside the courts. And even for Julian, it's like, well, this defies reason because this doesn't make sense. Why would they do such a thing? Because that makes them bad citizens.
The Hebrew version of monasticism, which you just mentioned, a lot of people might be unfamiliar with monasticism, with the monks. They would spend their entire lives contemplating this single idea. The Hebrew variation of that was the rabbis and their monastic class would find a single grievance and spend the rest of their life complaining about it.
On a more historically older note, rather than just our usual jokes about kvetching, no, I mean it did exist in sort of in the deserts and places like that, and then of course this later becomes a Christian thing, and it's noted by writers like Josephus that there were sort of these like potentially Christian. Some say that might have been added in, but there were definitely sort of these Jewish sects that had sort of wandered off into the desert trying to be like to find God in their own way. There were followers of John the Baptist that were not Christianized, but like it's mentioned in the book of Acts. And then you have other groups that take some of those teachings and make it their own thing and do it out there. And Christianity has its own version that evolves out of that. You can read about that with St. Anthony in the desert and the rest, but it's there. So I mean, with regards to like defying reason, if you go to the classic, like, and we covered this in the last episode, but like if we look at things like about might or what it means to be a citizen or what it means to actually believe in something and to objectively look at the world and take it in with our senses and say that this is how things go and that man has power over these things within his own action, and then you're introduced to the concept in which no, actually there is this supreme being in which the Son, which he has always had from the beginning of time and outside of time, because he's everlasting, had come down, died in the most excruciating, embarrassing way possible, rose again on the third day, and now we're all following him and going by his, beliefs and teachings that go contrary to all things that you kind of understand. And I had mentioned this in the last episode about the letter to Trajan about the Christians. It's Pliny's letter, where he's just like, I have no idea what to do with these people. I'm going to treat them like criminals because that's the only like method or system I have to understand these people. But they treat this so-called Christ as a god, which we don't recognize. And they only recognize this one God, which for the classical mind is akin to atheism because you deny the power or the divinity of all other gods. Although if you were to ask Christians of those times or even Christians of today who kind of know their scriptures and know their church tradition, they would say, oh no, that's not true. They'll tell you that they just think that they're demons, as David points out in the Psalter. But yeah, I mean, to defy reason, this is what Julian spends so much of his writing about and his reaction to it. And it's important to keep in mind that is what Cochrane's whole book is really about, is this clash between this Christian understanding of the world versus this ancient Roman tradition and the Platonic, Hellenistic, and I guess barbarous, Northern European influences on the empire, and how those two came to clash, and how the imperial state evolves as Christianity comes to become this legal religious institution that eventually becomes the dominant institution in the empire.
I also wanted to call attention to a couple of comments here I think are worth highlighting. From Fabian Cartouche, she says, the entelechy of deity/deities suffuses every second of time and millimeter of space and intermediates the contents of subjective experience among people whose worldview was yet unfiltered by, and the second part, industrial modes of measuring truth. I like that. Just we're kind of circling back to the
great take.
Yeah, the German idea that kicked this all off. And then just a few others here. Sean Weiland says faith exists before rationality. I mean, I'm not to return to that, but like I'm always reminded of a conversation I had with our good friend Christopher Sandbatch. I can hear his voice in my head saying, in a frustrated tone, saying how that's not true. Because it's almost like when we say faith, I'm not trying to be biased when I say this, but it is a distinct, more total Christian faith, and that what existed before might not have been faith in that sense, but it was more immersive. Like the idea of faith being that you had to give your entire mind and soul up to something that doesn't even justify itself rationally. Like it doesn't need to prove itself. That's what makes faith so strong. Whereas throughout history, people may have believed in a very literal paranormal world, but they didn't need to have faith in it. They just understood it to be real. So it was completely rational because the paranormal and nature were fused. Whereas we've separated faith from this world entirely, and it's become this other thing. I think that was more the transition. So there's a difference between faith and belief there. Not to dwell too much on that, but is what I'm saying make sense there?
Yeah.
Willie McDuff for $10 said nothing, not a word. Love to see it. So
we love that. We love when money just flows through without reason. Keep it flowing.
And Rotting Meat continues, having kind of fun to have this conversation right now. People have been discussing how the pagan miracles failed as Christianity rose. This book seems to ignore that dialogue. I don't know if that's a conversation going on in the pagan sphere right now. I mean, there's a lot that's not going to be discussed in this book. You cannot compress the entirety. And this is where maybe our criticisms might be unfair, because you can't discuss the entirety of Roman history.
That's where my criticisms are, because you can't just talk about the Roman concept of like the nation or the people or the soul, and then you're trying to contrast that with Christianity, and like you really don't talk about those compares and contrasts at all. And I get it. This book in itself is great. You really should read it. But at the same time, you're trying to compare these differences in mindset and how these like understandings of the world change. But you're not exploring their different. That's why I gave so much attention for this section on Julian, because these sort of conversations, I guess, that are happening in the backdrop, like, you can go online to the Internet Archive or whatever. You can read what's left of Julian's criticisms of Christianity. You can read what's left of Celsus and other critics, and you can read the Christian responses to it. These things are like 1,700 plus years old. Like, you want to see one of the earliest ones, go to Irenaeus, St. Irenaeus, go to St. Athenagoras of Athens and his like legalistic philosophical defense of Christianity to the Emperor of Rome. And it's totally these different understandings of trying to conceptualize, how do I make this totally foreign religion, this concept that flips the world upside down, as even the Jews call it out in the book of Acts, and try and make it make sense to a very Roman legal mindset where the metaphysical understanding of the world is totally different than what these guys are preaching. And for that alone, Cochrane does such a great job chronicling the history of the Roman state through this clash of ideas, religion, and worldview, specifically as the government of the Roman Empire tries to govern according to these principles.
Yeah, and I think that's a great transition into Augustine, because I know one important aspect you wanted to discuss was the city of God in this. And
honest to God, I thought about suggesting to you that we cover it just because, for context, everybody, this book is about 600 pages long, and it's a little less than 600 pages long if we stop at the footnotes. The City of God, written by St. Augustine, and if I were to leave out any footnotes or translations or anything like that, consists of over 20 books, and it concludes on my copy at least, my Penguins Classics version, is 1,091 pages long. To talk about the City of God in here is going to be a very condensed, tiny version. To talk about St. Augustine would also take a boatload of time. But one thing I do want to transition real quick before we get to St. Augustine is the chapter called State and Church in the New Republic. It's in the Renovation section. And it's particularly interesting because there's still this great deal of trying to make the world make sense after Julian dies and is left now with the Roman state, because you're now kind of dealing with a lot of the sort of the reforms that Julian tries to push kind of fade away, but they're still there. But also the Christian church is not going away anytime soon, and it's still going to be dealing with the same problems that we have with understanding the world as we know it. So, for instance, I'm going to just read it. For me, it's on page 342. I don't know where it is for you, but I'm just going to read it. Quote, in setting himself to preserve the essential constituents of the Roman order, Valentinian gave expression to an attitude common to at least two classes within the community. The first consisted of the traditionalist or philosophic pagans who, though they had manifested little or no enthusiasm for the reactionary program of Julian, nevertheless rejected the alternative proposed by Christianity. The second composed of an increasing number who, while professing adherence to the new faith, still saw it in reality through pagan eyes. Of the former, Ammonius Marcellinus may have taken as a representative. We have already cited as a testimony of Ammianus in favor of the new religious policy of Valentinian. Elsewhere, he comments with appreciation upon the fact that under this regime, the one that succeeds Julian, all persons receive the protection due to their rank and station, except in the solitary case of treason. In doing so, he endorses the claims made by the administration on his own behalf, and in general, he bears witness to the excellence of the government, pronouncing Valentinian weak only in his attitude to powerful army officers and the Valens, both stern and honest. The sentiments were thus expressed to be repeated in the years immediately following, when the clouds of Christian persecution have gathered round their heads. Devoted adherents of ancient culture recalled the measures of Valentinian as the pledge and guarantee of freedom, which by their day had ceased to exist. Ammonius, however, as his works show, lived in the past. His spiritual equipment was derived from the theologians and sophists of classical antiquity, whose names he revered and whose speculations in physics, ethics, and logic made the basis of his personal philosophy of life. In this philosophy, there is no appreciable advance upon views current among educated men in the days of Cicero and Livy. The same effort made to rationalize the notions implicit in popular mythology, the gods are depersonalized and reduced to qualities of things. Things, however, take their revenge inasmuch as by their process they acquire a positive character and exercise a positive influence upon mankind, constituting the conditions or controls in which they are imposed upon human civic activity. For these conditions, the collective name is fortuna, and thus once more emerges the correlation to virtues, and the interaction between virtues and fortune can be found in lex naturalis fatalis ordo, or the destiny of man. And again, for those who are familiar with their the wheel of fortune and how it spins, that this is where you kind of get that viewpoint. But even for Christians who are sort of singing the praises to the world that they know about it, there's an interesting section here, and I'm going to go give it to you here. Quote, the same no problem arises in the connection to poets who, Christian, no less than pagan, regularly employed the ideological apparatus traditional to classical thought and art. Such as, however, ambiguity may be fairly said to disappear with Ausonius, than whom there could hardly be a character more typical of his age. He was a lawyer and a rhetorician from Bordeaux. He was summoned by court to to Valentinian to serve as a tutor to Gratian, and in generous recognition of his services, Gratian later to elevate him to his consulship. In his well-known Eastern hymn, after speaking of the Trinity, he concludes with the following, and my Latin is dog shit, so I'm not going to butcher it, but I am going to translate it for you because it is really interesting. And I'll, let's see here, translate. Such an example is seen in the earthly world. Augustus, the father of twins, Augustus, who have embraced him, brother and son, piously, as he does share the kingdom with God, nor does he divide it, having all things, alone and having bestowed on all things. Therefore these, who are alive with us today in threefold piety, may the rulers of the earth and ministers of heaven, O Christ, be present with the eternally pleasing Father. And so this is already on the end of a poem about, you know, the resurrection of Christ, and he concludes talking about the Roman tradition and the Roman family and sort of giving it this comparison to the Trinity. Cochrane finishes off saying, the difficulty involved in elaborating the simile is by no means inconsiderable, in order that it may represent all respects to be precise. Valentinian and the senior Augustus must be represented as father to Valens as well as to Gratian, and thus the first person of that triune majesty which through its several members controls the destinies of one indivisible empire. Apart from this discrepancy, however, the poet, in a flight comparable with anything achieved by his pagan predecessors, has succeeded in translating the central dogma of Christian orthodoxy into a piece of characteristic mythological fancy, while at the same time he transmutes the imperial power into a kind of earthly providence. By doing so, he aptly illustrates, if not the nature of the Trinity, at any rate the triumph of pagan over Christian ways of thought. And in thus bearing witness to a victory of the old way of thought over the new, he associates himself, in effect, with what still survived of the sentiments and aspirations consecrated in the secular system of Rome. And I think that's really interesting, that even still, as he's, you know, offering this hymn on the resurrection day, the feast of feasts, this ultimate Christian war-like victory over death itself, we're still looking at it through the old lens of the classical pagan Roman understanding of power and earthly dominion. And that, I think, is what makes this book so damn interesting.
Yeah, and he continues on. I'd be jumping ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
But this really is a thread through the book, because he returns to this idea, and I hate using the word synthesis, but I was overcome with fascination with the idea of the struggle between, he calls it secularism here, but secularism and Christianity, and how the domination was more, you know, overtaking the other and absorbing it. And I'm on page 508 here, skipping ahead a whole few sections. But
what section is this?
This, where the fuck is it? It's in Regeneration, Divine Necessity, and Human History.
Okay, go ahead.
It says, to subvert the ideology of secularism was not to destroy the actual structure of secular society. It was merely to envisage it in a new light. Yet this was of immense importance, for it was to see the state no longer as the ultimate form of community, but merely an instrument for regulating the relations of what Augustine called the exterior man. This function is fulfilled by the application of methods, the value of which depended on their efficacy as a means of intimidating evil and enabling the good to live more quietly among them. And from this standpoint, the institutions of the secular order, quote, had not been designed in vain, but might claim the justification of a certain reason and utility. The advantage thus realized was, however, purely negative, since the effect of law is to condemn the act without removing the evil disposition. It was, moreover, attained by damming back psychological forces, the explosiveness of which is proportionate to the pressure which the state finds necessary to exert. To see history in this light is to see the point of departure between the two societies, both alike enjoying temporal goods and suffering temporal evils, both a faith that is different, a hope that is different, a love that is different. To this task, the Christian militiaman is impelled by the conviction that, as Christian truth alone is genuinely salutary, its immediate acceptance is of the highest possible moment to the welfare of the race. For him, therefore, history is prophecy, i.e., its true significance lies not in the past nor the present, but in the future, the life of the world to come. I just thought that was a really interesting way of summarizing it. Like the duty to the people became higher, and I think when people, maybe even Julian saw this, like these people are removing themselves from the world, the monastic class, and even all Christians are just trying to remove themselves from the affairs of the real world. And then, what's the purpose of that? But what you saw, especially for the martial class of Christians, was an affirmation of the people, of the race, but justifying it on a deeper level and even a higher level. And so it wasn't severing themselves from secular society. And he's got that great line here. It's merely to envisage it in a new light. So it didn't lose much of that civic nature, but it was more forcing people to engage with it differently. How does that sound correct, or is that a complete misinterpretation?
No. It's correct, and in fact, it's backed up on the section with Emperor Theodosius and the religion of the state. Because when he's talking now about trying to govern as a Christian prince, Cochrane writes this. By contrast with earlier forms of polity, the Orthodox Empire was characterized by two developments of fundamental importance. The first was the explicit acceptance of Nicene Christianity as the embodying substance of the Catholic faith. And for listeners out there, when we pre-1054, if you were to say Catholic or Orthodox, it's essentially interchangeable. Second, the deliberate adoption of that faith as a principle of social integration. In accepting Catholicism, the state finally abandoned pretensions which originally put forward by pagan authorities on behalf of the Augustine Empire, but nevertheless been maintained in an ambiguous sense by Christian sovereigns from Constantine to Valentinian. And this connection is no mere coincidence that doctrinal formulations first made by the Council of Nicaea should have been reaffirmed almost contemporaneously at the Council of Constantinople, the Church thus vindicating itself to prerogatives which, since the time of Virgil, had been claimed by the Eternal City. But while primacy thus had passed from the secular to the spiritual power, at the same time the recognition in Catholicism of a principle of universal validity and application suggested the possibility of its adoption as the basis of a new social order in which the state could find its justification for existence in defending the peace of the Church. And this idea may be seen in spirit and purpose of the Theodosianism and found expression through in the thoroughgoing effort to realize that within the framework of the Roman system, the forms of a Catholic state, with this consummation, the ambiguities which had characterized the intervals from Constantine to Theodosius, and which were perhaps inevitable in an age of transition, finally disappeared, and there ensued a period of energetic imperial house cleaning, in which the last energies of government were invoked to enforce the theory and practice of orthodoxy. And so it's taken quite a few years, but now you're kind of seeing a formal liquidation of those old ways in terms of the religious practices finally come under play under Theodosius. But the Roman understanding of like an eternal Rome, an eternal city, the city of God, although St. Augustine is not particularly fond of Rome at all, there's still what's present is that old Roman conception of this metaphysical justification for the existence and the universality of Rome itself, now transitioning from maybe temporal, God-man-esque emperors into a church in which you can still, as an individual, doesn't matter your station or power or status, can commune with God himself.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to lead into this next part, because we're getting closer and closer to discussing Augustine or Augustine. I always said Augustine, but then I started hearing priests say Augustine, so I don't want to go to fucking hell. So
my roommate's patron saint is Augustine, and he's like I've heard it both ways, but I just go by Augustine.
Seems like an easy saint. You know what I mean? Like it's like
to pick.
It's the one everyone likes.
Yeah,
you can pick a weirder saint, like a deep cut saint.
There are some deep cuts.
Yeah. What's your favorite band? The Beatles too? Like.
And I mean, for anyone who Anglicans also have this as well, but like, and I have a deep love for the Anglo-Celtic saints that the Eastern Church recognizes. So like everyone that that you can think of is definitely on that list, but it's just like there's some obscure ones. There's some that like, who are the Stylites? And I'm like, oh, those are these monks that basically like lived in a tower and then never left until they died. Like that's a fun one to get into if you want some deep cuts. I mentioned Saint Athenagoras of Athens. He's recognized in the Eastern Church. There's a deep cut. Why are like half the most popular names in Greeks Panagiotis? Well, that's because it's the male version of Panagia, which means the Blessed One or the Virgin. You can have fun with deep cuts. It's a good time.
Yeah, and I'm a guy who only likes Radiohead B-sides, so I know a thing or two about, deep cuts that are hostile to the sensibilities of other people. I wanted to read this part here. It's kind of building on what we're talking about. I'm on page. Am I even on the right page? What the fuck am I doing? I'm jumping.
Also, if you want an idea of what the calendar system becomes as we know it, this is before the Gregorian reforms in the West, but like you get this from Emperor Theodosius. So, this edict in the prefect of every city pronounced all the days to be juridical, with the following exceptions: a long vacation, 24th of June to 15th of October, on the account of the summer heat and the necessities of the autumn harvest. We've always had summer vacation, folks. The 1st of January, customary holiday week. The anniversaries of Rome and Constantinople's founding. The Easter holiday of 2 weeks, including 7 days preceding Holy Week and 7 days following Easter Sunday, Bright Sunday. The Lord's Day anniversaries and the birth and ascension of reigning emperors of Rome. In the year 400, Christmas Day and Epiphany were also consecrated, thus completing the Christian year. Thus, in 412, by an interesting and significant concession to the Jews, courts will not sit on Saturdays, the Sabbath. We've gotten our weekend as far back as 412. The enforcement of the new calendar was ensured by the suppression of the old by imperial edict. So the idea of the traditional 5-day work week in our weekends, they come from here.
Thank God.
And that's okay. So I mentioned this briefly when we kind of talked about Eusebius last time, but like this was a very popular conception around Constantine and Constantius, was that like, and it's not a popular one. In fact, quite a few other bishops and saints of that time were like very much against this, but for Eusebius and quite a few others around the imperial capitals, both in Rome and in what would become Constantinople, were like, the Roman Empire is this like divinely ordained institution by God himself, that we have now achieved imperial peace so that the gospel of Christ may be evangelized throughout the empire, and thus the world as the empire expands. Eusebius is very big on this idea. Not so much others or contemporaries like him, whether it's John Chrysostom or others, but it's particularly interesting because that dies so fast after Constantine goes away. They're like, well, we like thank God for this emperor who's legalized us, allows us to do this. He's a saint in the Eastern Church, and so. Not to mention all the stuff that his mother had done as well, whether it's finding the cross, building the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, etc. But then it's just like, oh, isn't it great? And then it's like, yeah, no, here's this next emperor who fucking hates you. And it's just that this idea dies, but nevertheless, it's still kind of present that there is things that take place that are beyond man, our powers as men, that sort of spread things out, and that kind of gets us into Augustine's worldview in comparison to perhaps others and philosophers of his time who he's writing against, whether it's the city of God against the pagans, or on Christian doctrine against the philosophers, how to live a happy life, confessions. I mean, there's so much that Augustine writes throughout his entire lifetime that it would be hard to narrow it down, but it's really worth addressing here. Cochrane spends so much time on it.
Get this guy a Substack. That's what I say. Before we build on that point, because I have something that relates directly to that, I just wanted to address something from Tree Surgeon here. Fog is the best Radiohead B-side. Fight me. I will not fight you, but I will forgive you. The correct answer to that was formerly Big Boots, which turned into Man of War from their most recent release. But I do think the superior B-side would be one of the two versions of Talk Show Host. There's actually two versions of the song Talk Show Host. One is better than the other, but they're not different titles. You just got to find both and then have them and then know that one is better. So thank you for understanding and correcting your opinion.
Just like there are different versions of Weird Al's, it's all Billy Joel to me that he doesn't sing anymore.
Is it?
Yeah, there's a few versions out.
Don't lie to me, Prude.
I'm not lying to you.
Okay, good. I need some Weird Al fucking
Okay,
esoterica.
I'll tell it. All right, chat, you in for a fun time? The best show I've ever been to in terms of like clean venue, nice place, great show, great host was a live Weird Al show. Like the best concert experience of my life was a Weird Al show live. And I will die on that hill. Fight me.
There's a lot of people looking to die on hills tonight.
To be the case.
I believe it. I've never seen him live. He's still.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
that's one of the whitest things I've probably ever done in my life.
I've been surprised by shows before too. Like I really liked seeing Leonard Cohen live. I saw him live on one of his, not long before he died. And you would think that he wouldn't cut a, very enigmatic figure on stage. He's like 103 years old by that point. He's all hunched over, and he's at that level of Jewish age where they just go full steam to the bottom. Like he's full on like
where
rabbi
he looked like
mode.
a total anti-Semitic caricature.
Yeah, but I'm like, fuck, this guy's really cool. I didn't expect him to be as cool and like with it and hip as that, and it's not I don't like those sorts of crooner type figures, but I was like, but it was I was the youngest person in that audience.
Did he sing Chelsea Hotel No. 2?
He sings all the fucking hits. So yeah, Hallelujah's in there, Tower of Songs. I'd like 3 out of 10 Leonard Cohen songs, maybe 2. I don't like all. He's not like Tom Waits to me. I love all Tom Waits shit. Leonard Cohen, once in a while. I was just
curious if he was gonna sing about him fucking Janis Joplin, like while he's like 100-something years old.
He probably did. Like he's like, why is that wrong? Because he can get away with it. He was like, what's that? Like a Jewish Lothario, like a ladies' man, but he looks like David Schwimmer. Like I didn't know. Like the psychology of that guy's wild.
I think the Jewish Lothario is just Seinfeld.
The Jewish Lothario is just a rapist. It's just a man who rapes. That's a Digital Archipelago type joke. I shouldn't have brought that to Do You Even?
It's okay. I was flabbergasted because I made a vitiligo joke where I said it's a condition you get when you stop stealing after 5 years. And I was laughing to myself. I was like, yeah, it was pretty good.
Vice President Vance, we apologize. Strike that from the record. We got some big fans for this
Strike
show.
that from the record on our Palatine social credit scores, if you could, please.
No, let's get back to Augustine. Let's get back to the city of God.
Yeah, let's get back to divine necessity.
There's the great segment here I love. It says, as thus envisaged, the work of Augustine possesses a twofold significance. To begin with, it offers a way to escape from the insoluble riddles of classicism, as well as from those of the marginal systems of thought which succeeded the extinction of the purely classical spirit. So he's talking about there's a purity of the classical spirit. By this point, it was already becoming disjointed. Seen in the light of the new ancient principium or the first principle, problems inherent to the discarded ideology either recede into the background or, in another context, assume a wholly different complexion. At the same time, Augustinianism emerges not as a conglomerate of indiscriminate borrowings, but as a mature philosophy which seeks to do justice to all aspects of experience and, in particular, to overcome the apparent discrepancy between the demands of order and those of process, i.e., between the so-called Apolline and Dionysic elements in life. In the respect the limitations of classicism were those of reason. Accordingly, in rejecting its pretensions, Augustine associates himself with the revolt against reason, which we have elsewhere noted as typical of Christianity. I just thought that was a great way to summarize, to place Augustine firmly within the scope of what we're talking about here, what he brought to the table, and to reaffirm, not only faith, but perhaps the Augustine city of God, that revolution of faith as opposing reason.
Yeah, and the other thing too that he writes, and this is about like the classical versus the Christian conceptualization of history. To the Christian, the failure of classical historiography was the result of its inability to discover the true cause of human beings and motivation. Accordingly, it pointed to a substitution of the logos of Christ for that of classicism as a principle of understanding. In other words, to the abandonment of secular literature in favor of the Bible as a repository of historical truth. But to claim the historicity of the Bible was not in itself, as Augustine perceived, to provide oneself with a ready-made solution for all possible difficulties. For while the authority of Scripture was admittedly absolute, its meaning was not always clear. On the contrary, it was veiled in enigma, the nature of which was twofold. The first and most obvious source of difficulty was verbal, since words as symbols or signs of meaning occasionally bore double significance, and in such cases there was always the danger of getting one's signals mixed. But to the verbal was added the material ambiguity arising from the fact that the teaching, even with regard to the fundamentals, appeared to differ in different books, especially the Old and New Testaments, and in some respects the divergence was so vast to suggest an absolute relativity of that doctrine. And this is, of course, where you get into Marcionism. But for Augustine, he writes, Augustine was not content until he had found a way of answering the question so seriously with respects to Marcion or Manichaean rationalism. In doing so, he developed a new and distinctive basis for interpretation. To begin with, he recognized that words, as instruments of expression, could operate no less effectively to embalm than to enshrine truth. It was thus apparent that he could not accept and defend in a literal sense every statement of Scripture. For the rejection of literalism, Augustine invoked the authority of St. Paul, the letter killeth, and in throwing it overboard, he doubtless owed something to the example of Ambrose, St. Ambrose of Milan. But he did not escape from the pitfalls of literalism in order to lose himself in the banalities of allegory. And this has been an ongoing thing for 2,000 plus years. For also, just it still exists today with the Jews. Go look at the Talmud. It's like thousands of pages of rabbis arguing over interpretation. For he perceived that, however obscure and difficult to comprehend, the purpose of words was nonetheless to convey meaning, and in order to arrive at this meaning, it was necessary to understand the true significance of the text. This presupposed a knowledge of Greek and Hebrew, the language of the text, which had been originally composed in. Then, for the solution of merely verbal questions, it was possible to derive help from different branches of secular scholarship, thus, quote, spoiling the Egyptians, end quote, of the fruit of their inquiries in mathematics, the natural sciences, including astronomy, the mechanical arts, history and institutions, rhetoric, and dialectic. Of these, rhetoric and dialectic might be used to resolve ambiguities of interpretation arising from double significance of words, either by reference to the context of those terms in one way or another of various figures of speech. This was not so much to prostitute science to religion to recognize that while Scripture contained elements of dogma, it was, as literature, subject to the rules of criticism in the current school of liberal arts. And so what are we getting out of here? Well, one, we have to find a way to make Scripture makes sense to the masses, but also to our enemies. But also that he's realizing that you have to understand Greek and Hebrew. You have to understand those words very well. And secondly, that we can take from secular or non-Christian sources as a way to contextualize words, histories, sciences, and understandings of their time. And so, I mean, for Augustine or for Augustine, he's very well read on the ancients as well as, the Scriptures themselves. He has a whole commentary on the Psalter and for every psalm, and in those commentaries you can also see him reference the works of others alongside Scripture itself.
That was always interesting to me. People describe it as Christian universalism, but I do think that way of understanding the role of, let's say, spreading the message is at the root of this entire process we're describing, because with Jews, certainly aspects of their power and influence can spread, but it's not like Judaism seeks to recruit or proselytize.
It used to.
How far long ago would you say that occurred?
Oh, probably.
I'm putting you on the spot. I apologize.
You're gonna put me on the spot. So if we read parts of Antiquities from Josephus, you'll notice that there's quite an extensive use of the word proselyte, and it's also mentioned in some of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Judaism did use to evangelize, and it's probably around the time the Romans start shutting shit down. So you have to keep in mind, Christ is not the only, at the time of Christ and after his resurrection and ascension, there are other individuals that claim to be the Jewish Messiah. And they're looking at, of course, also in reaction to Christianity, the Jewish interpretation of the Messiah radically changes from the suffering servant, or a servant who is to take on the sins of the world or the sins of others, but to be more of a political Messiah, one who will overthrow Rome and one who will do all these things, and to be this, like, finally we get this Jewish overlord. And that's still their interpretation of the Messiah today. But it stops after 70 AD, because after 70 AD, Judea is renamed to Syrian Palestine, which is in reference to the Philistines, the ancient Jewish enemy of the Old Testament, and that Jews become so insular, and because they're a diaspora, they stop proselytizing lest they become a political target for persecution. And of course, that comes with a whole bunch of other problems. Like, we don't really get to see a rabbinical school kind of get a blessing or a sign off from the Roman Empire, not for like another 75 years until like the 130s AD. And the leadership at that time, because of numerous Jewish revolts, like being messianic or claiming to be the Messiah and to have a following, dies afterwards. And also, by extension, proselytization of the Jewish faith. Not to say that they didn't enslave people. For instance, they still hate Emperor Theodosius for banning the circumcision and trade of Christian slaves by Jewish slave owners.
And you know what? Hearing you describe it, their proselytization sounds more like recruiting an army, because everything.
Well, that's how the Romans saw it.
Yeah, it's political. It's like our Messiah is just the new king that's going to give us what we want. So by our proselytization, we just want strength in numbers to overthrow an army. Whereas the Christian proselytization would be spreading a message from the message's sake. If that's it's a different sort of recruitment. It's not so, utilitarian to the immediate. And you could argue that's a characteristic of Judaism, that it is very of this world. It is very cunning. And
it certainly changes, because not only do you have to deal with the Romans, but you also have to deal with this movement, Christianity, which claims to have the authority to interpret the scriptures better. And there's a great blog post by Dr. Henry Hopwood Phillips that sort of goes into the tensions and relations between Jews and Christians in the Byzantine Empire, because that's sort of his field of study is Byzantine history. And in it, he sort of just describes like that became the central component that later we see it in the West under these famous disputations, is that the burgeoning Christian movement, the burgeoning Jesus movement, or the church, becomes and claims over these Jewish leaders of various types that we know the scriptures better than you do. And this is why, for well-read Christians, that they'll kind of know, like, the Jewish understanding of the Messiah changes. There's this concern over the Masoretic versus the Septuagint translation. And at that point, the Septuagint is rejected by most Jewish leaders after the destruction of the temple, because that is what, if you read the New Testament, this is what Christ quotes. This is what the evangelists quote when it comes to citing the Old Testament. That's why you'll notice a big difference if you read maybe a Masoretic translation of the Old Testament compared to the Septuagint. But it's there, and that's a big reason why it stops. But in regards to history, to go back to Augustine, you get this really interesting look at what's popular on our side of things, cyclical history, versus how Augustine looks at history itself. I thought that I have a whole section here that I had kept and trying to find it now. But it was about how Augustine had rejected the notion of cyclical history, which I thought was really interesting. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. But if not, you can interrupt.
I got a section here. I was just
in
my notes, I had to erase a part of it that had some Latin, because when I copied it over, it did not copy over the land. It was just some gobbledygook, so I just had to erase that for easy reading. It says here, to Augustine, the real purpose of Scripture is to reveal the means whereby we may attain to a just and happy life. And this is kind of what I was trying to get at before. In this sense, it is indubitably apocalyptic. It thus points unerringly to a future which includes the conversation of the Jews, the reign of Antichrist, the second coming of Christ, the last judgment, separation of the good from the evil, the conflagration and renewal of the world. Throughout his work, there have been numerous indications of the role played by the concept of fortune in pagan thought. The repudiation is both explicit and comprehensive. He goes, omnia recava, blah, 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 blah. Everything he says must be referred to divine providence. It thus includes the notion of chance, whether conceived as mere fortuity or as a pagan providence, the deus ex machina of poets and historians. This is the individual historical event, is ipso facto unique and unpredictable for us as observers. It is impossible to recognize its relationships until after it has occurred, and then only imperfectly. This, however, provides no valid reason for supposing that it marks the intervention of an arbitrary and erratic cosmic force. By thus discarding characteristic prejudices of classical mentality, Augustine opens the way for a philosophy of history in terms of the logos of Christ, i.e., in terms of the Trinity recognized as the creative and moving principle. From this standpoint, the problem of the Christian is not so much to read into nature the values of truth, beauty, and goodness as to detect those values in it. So that's another way of summarizing what I was saying before about the purpose of spreading Christianity. Did you find that segment that you're looking for?
I sure did. Yeah, and also like on what you're talking about too. You know, this also requires, as Augustine would cite it in the City of God, that, you know, to repudiate astrology, you know, the stars, he asserts, are not the fate of Christ, but Christ is the fate of the stars. Our souls, therefore, are by nature subject to no part of physical creation, even to that of the heavens. But it also rejects what may be called a humanist compromise, the notion that man shares with circumstance the determination of his destiny, and thus standpoint denial of fate is at the same time a denial of fortune. But for him, it's the recentering of the Christian, you know, the Christian understanding of what is at the center of the world rather than near fate. But this was really interesting to me because we spend so much time in these sides of things. You and I have talked extensively in the past about Joseph Tainter. Everyone and their mother has claimed to read Spangler and then probably fucking hasn't. Although if you do read Spangler, the most important chapter he's got is on numbers, not just his cycles of civilization. That's a dry as fuck boring chapter to read, but it's really important.
Yeah, you brought that up once before, and it made me realize that maybe I didn't read Spangler with the type of mind and
form and
eyes
actuality. But I mean, no, I bring that chapter up, one, because it pisses off one specific person I know who's read Spangler, but two, it's just a really good section.
Yeah, because it's these massive volumes, and I remember reading it, but like most people, I only retained maybe 10% of it, but I got to return to it soon. I got to get these fucking numbers in my head. Sorry. Enough about Spangler.
Yeah. Well, no, perfect time to bring up Spangler, though. To Christians, of course, this is on divine necessity in human history. To Christians, of course, nothing could be more abhorrent than the theory of cycles, for it flatly contradicts the scriptural view of the sacred, or of what is to come, the beginning to end, a continuous and progressive disclosure of creative and moving principle. It likewise denies, by implication, the Christian message of the salvation of mankind. In the form which it assumes with classical materialism, it represents motion as dependent on forces beyond control, or as a modern writer would put it, the irrational conduit of history. For the classical idealism, it takes shape as a belief of the endless reiteration of typical situations, a belief which does the grossest injustice to the unique character and significance of the individual historical event. Augustine's repugnance for cycles finds its expression in this impressioned outburst in the City of God. Quote, "Far it be from the true faith," he declares, "that by these words of Solomon we should believe are meant those cycles by which they, the world's philosophers, suppose that the same revolution of times and of temporal things are repeated, so that, as one might say, just in the age of the philosopher Plato sat in the city of Athens in a school called the Academy teaching his pupils, so also through countless ages ages at past intervals, which are great, nevertheless certain. Both the same Plato and the same city and the same school and the same pupils have been repeated, as they are destined to be repeated throughout countless ages of the future. God forbid, I say, that we should swallow such nonsense. Christ died once and for all for our sins. Continuing on. In this bold assertion, he bears witness to the faith of Christians that notwithstanding all appearances, human history does not consist of a series of repetitive patterns, but marks a sure, if unsteady, advance to an ultimate goal. As such, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. In this conviction, he finds the marching orders, so to speak, of the militia of Christ. And also remember, as Paul writes to Timothy, to be militant as a good officer unto Christ Jesus. For Augustine, therefore, the order of human life is not the order of matter, blindly and aimlessly working out the logic of its own process, nor yet is it a mere reproduction of a pattern or idea which may be apprehended a priori by the human mind. To think of it as either one is to commit a scientific sin of fornicating with one's own fancies, in other words, the disembodying the logos in such a way as to rob the time, or sacred understanding, of all possible significance. For the Christian, time, space, matter, and form are all alike, in the words of St. Ambrose, not gods, but gifts. They thus present themselves not as causes, but opportunity. As such, they must be said to unite and to divide. This they are giving status to individuals in the saculum. By this status involves specific limitations, not the least of which is difficulty in communicating with our fellows. This difficulty is intensified by the confusion of tongues, the diversity of languages, which results from the effort of men to surround themselves with economic and cultural barriers of their own creation, and from it not even the saint can claim to be exempt. What Moses said this and passed on, remarks Augustine, what did he really mean? The difficulty in question is that creatures whose limitations of mind and sense compel them to adopt such expedients of making noises in the air, yet he accepts these limitations as inescapable, sharply denounces all attempts to establish a mystical bridge between one individual and another, or between the generations, as promptings of the devil. From this standpoint, human history presents itself as a tissue of births and deaths, in which generations succeed one another in regular order. In this context of generations, each and every individual has his own times and spaces, so that the notion of man out of his age is a vicious and irrelevant abstraction. And I'll leave it there, but I just think that that's interesting. I know that sounds like, oh, we're going to do the same thing forever and ever, amen, and that's the end of that. And Augustine rejects that, and promptly so. Because it's particularly interesting because we have this renewed emphasis on that. You can definitely see where Marx gets the end of history from. It is definitely cribbed from there. That's why you see certain spicy writers, Spengler included, talking about Christianity being the ancestor of Bolshevism. But that concept that there is an end, I mean, that is present. We don't know when it will be the end. We don't know when Christ comes back. And that, and this is a topic that still gets debated as early as Augustine. I know the late Father Thomas Hopko talked about it, where he had said, every Christian thinks that he's living in the end times and that this is the last age. But obviously we're closer to the end of the world because more time has passed, but we don't really know.
Yeah, it's the popularity of millenarianism.
Yeah, and again, you get all sorts of interesting ways to interpret the apocalypse or what is to come. But I find this particularly interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt. Just an interesting contrast between ways of looking at cycles or things that have always been, they will be again.
Yeah, and I think that's one aspect of Christianity that I think was truly revolutionary. There are many aspects of it, but it's the conflict between linear time and cyclical time. And there's still, of course, people throughout the world that engage in cyclical time. That Indians, Hindu, everyone's aware of the Yuga cycle, the Kali Yuga cycle. I believe they're like 10,000 year.
The wheel of samsara.
Yeah, it's a more ancient belief. The concept of linear time, by which I mean, and even linear is to the modern mind somewhat reductive, but it means that the death and resurrection of Christ was a singular event or two singular events. It does not repeat. It doesn't happen again every 10,000 years. It was a definite thing, and you can chart everything before and after that. And that gave birth to this idea that we are in one spectrum of time, one linear timeline where things can happen once, and which would imply there's a beginning and a middle and an end, which is a very starkly different way of looking at the world, because to the very core of your essence, you don't believe in reincarnation. When you die, you either go to heaven or to hell, but you don't just come back later. You're not reincarnated as another type of animal. You don't just swap bodies. You're a being, and this is part and parcel with the comprehension of individuality, that there's one of you, and you don't just clone yourself. You don't just bop around and come back. That you go somewhere else forever. And I think that's such a crucial dimension of Christianity, which is being able to approximate your position within the eternal. You're not just an aspect of nature. You're not just the leaves. You're not just the rocks and the water. You're something apart from that. And so this is all being developed in the same time. Yeah. And I know we had a note, because we have to get going soon, I believe, on the new imperial system. Did we get to that? Was that
we talked? Well, and I mentioned it with Theodosius, just because he really does try and, I mean, he's the one that more or less kicks out paganism from the calendar and from public worship in the games, and there's that there too. But I think for Cochrane especially, as we're comparing Augustinian thought to sort of these classical understandings of history, what we're getting out of this new imperial system, at least on a metaphysical level, is what critics or others would just call it out as, is like this radical transformation or even inversion from the classical understanding of the world to today, or at least for early Christian thought, because I mean Christian thought today has been so thoroughly fucked over by communism, liberalism, wolves in sheep's clothing. But I just found this, and also about reincarnation too, because why does that fly in the face of things? Because it flies in the face of the Christian understanding of the bodily resurrection at the end of time. It's not just your soul goes to heaven or whatever. Like, when all this does end, it will be with the body that you had. Don't know what that'll look like. I guess I'll find out when the day comes.
Yeah, but I love that permanence, a literal permanence.
Yeah, there is a literal permanence. There is an end to it, which is why the Christian mind, for Augustine and others, and also with the rise of monasticism, there is that very real understanding that, like, what I do here is very limited, and the concept of eternity should haunt you and should scare the shit out of you, because I think it's the 6th century. I think he's in the 6th century. Like Saint Isaac the Syrian had famously written that this life is not for the pursuit of vainglory, but for repentance and the life to come. Because, we don't know when we die. And earlier Christian writers, like St. John Cassian, had said, listen, it doesn't matter how many vigils or prayers or how many times you commune. If you're a slave to anger and you don't reconcile with others, nothing's going to do anything to save you. There's this emphasis on what is to come. And, of course, there is the question about what to do in the meantime. And that's why there's this emphatic part where, of course, the master wants to see you working, the parable of the talents. Which, of course, flies in the face of what we see in the importance in the earlier sections about the classical understanding of the world, which is that my idea of immortality is to be recited in an epic that Homer or someone like Virgil would write about, to have my name listed on this pantheon of great heroes, that one day I may have a game held in my honor for my deeds. I'm not thinking about the where my judgment. The ancient Egyptians do, but even then, we have all these great things, these material possessions that we will take with us into the afterlife, tangibly with us. That's why our slaves and our dogs and our bitches go with us down into the temple or down into the pyre. Whereas that totally gets flipped on its head with the introduction of Christianity.
Yeah, you want to hear some goofy shit?
Yeah, sure.
My wife, also Catholic, bless her, but she went and decided to have a girl brain. And just the other day, she says to me, Dimes, says, what would be nice after we pass away if we had our, ashes put into a tree and that tree could grow. And I looked at her, I said, listen, bitch. I said, what we're doing is we're going in a mausoleum because we're coming back. You're going to burn me? And she's like, maybe I've been very strict on this, where she had said, I don't want to be a bother to people. A lot of older people say, just cremate me. I don't want to be a burden.
You're dead. You don't get.
yeah, I am dead. But here's the thing: I want to be a burden. She's like, and she knows I want a huge funeral. I want a statesman's funeral, even though I ain't shit. I want a packed cathedral, and we're getting a mausoleum. I don't care if you want to go in. I'm going in. I'll go in myself. And you're going to look like a horse's ass when these chickens come home to roost.
I like the idea that like the only time I ever meet Dimes in person is at his funeral, and I can't say shit to him. It's like, you don't want to disrespect the dead. It's just like, you faggot. Like I could have met you soon.
You better go up there and give a speech. You better
It's just going to be this collection of just this diverse group of racists and pagans and Christians from all over Canada and North America.
Everyone fucking gets there. It's in his will. You got to do a live podcast.
This will be the first live racist podcast inside some cathedral that didn't get burned down.
It's like, what if we say no? Yeah, it's the whole place is wired with explosives and.
The episode title of this eulogy is called "The Samson Option." Dimes is rated to explode if I don't talk for more than 10 minutes.
So he says that, and you're hearing like a smattering of applause and laughter in the audience. Like, classic Dimes. That's exactly what he said he would do. There's a couple good comments I want to get to.
Sure.
On what we've been talking about. Sex Freakman.
What a great name!
I love this guy. He makes a good point here. It says it's true that cyclicism is a more ancient belief, but it seems the older ones are more linear because the various creation myths you have really don't suggest the floaty things repeat forever. And yes, I consider the Vikings, the Tree of Life. Like when I think of even what the fuck am I thinking of? It's like this old book. It's like one of the first mythologies. Anyway, but there's creation myths, and how can you have a creation myth without linear time? I understand where he's coming from. I need to look deeper into it because I know some of those creation myths tend to be cyclical as well. Because what they are based on is the seasons, and it would make sense why you would model these creation myths after the seasons, because there's always death and rebirth. So even when the universe ends,
I just pulled out my copy of the Golden Bow. Now I'm going looking for creation myths.
Yeah, that's one of the reference materials I was thinking about. It's not. I want to say Beowulf. It's not Beowulf, but it's something. Anyway, I'm not going to kill time with that.
No, but I'm going to go look for it now.
I see where he's coming from, and I do get that. There might be. I was also thinking of, like I said, Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. Looking at
that's such a great book.
Yeah, like really savage tribes and their creation. Like many of them lack creation myths. So I think a proper creation myth it's only achievable by a sufficiently advanced people, right? But I'd have to look deeper into the Mongols. I'd love to know a bit more about that. Anyway, we can spend a lot of time in there. Also, Mark Trouble here says Augustine centers the law of the divine and the conscience, and this is also the beginning of the self-same, which stretches in Shakespeare and modern conceptions of human identity and personality. Not sure anything to disagree with there. Just a nice comment, a good post. I'm glad
gems here, sir.
I also like that we moved past the debate over Judaism, which was occurring in the chat for what seemed like 45 minutes.
I just don't read chat when we do this show.
It's a good chat, but it's not even what you think.
Because I know exactly what we're talking about, and I'm like, this is either going to be turbo cancer or it's going to be really good.
It was about the borders of Judea. It was very topographical and it was very good. It ain't your bog standard anti-Semitism. We bring the professionals,
the high IQ.
Sorry, Ilya McGuffey, the Israelites.
Couldn't help myself.
Look at this. Look at this post here. This is the type of stuff I can't get into right now. I don't got the gumption for this right now. Did you want to reference the Golden Bough? You got the book out, and
I'm literally going to find stuff on creation myths.
I gotta read. Like I've read other books that reference that one, but I haven't read that one specifically, and I'd love to. The problem with so much of this generative anthropology and
I got
deep mythology.
this copy that I have, and I don't know which edition it is. It's with a new foreword, but this one was published in 1980. I know this book was originally published in 1890, but so I got this. This is my fun story, and I guess maybe we can conclude here for the night.
First of all, Hazael's Epic of Gilgamesh. That's what I was thinking of.
There you go. Another sort of the universality of flood myths of ancient history. And you had also mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh when you guys did that episode on Atlantis shit like 2 years ago. I follow the Blood Satellite podcast. I know what I'm talking about.
We started off as fans of each other before we started.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. Isn't it just nice when you find people that you can be racist with?
Also, Prude, the deep story here is that Prude really got me into neorealism and a lot of the more higher order.
A long time ago,
stuff.
I used to do geopol. I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, and you got, I remember I came to you. I'm like, what's good reference material? And you just gave me a list, and now I beat politics. I get it all. And if you listen to Prude long enough, you'll just end up being right. That's the greatest gift he can give you with politics. You'll just be right about politics. If you ever wanted to be right, you can do that. Just read a few of these books. And then nothing else.
That's very kind of you. No, what I was going to say, though, on this is that this copy I got, I'm not going to say where, because I don't want to be mean or dox or anything, but I met Semi-Agog in person a couple of years ago. And I stayed at his lovely estate for a night in my travels, because it was a 2-day drive back home. And he goes, Prude, I got so much shit for you. And I'm dragged to his garage / workout station / where he live streams from. And now I'm like, oh, this all makes sense. And it's a giant library of stuff. And he's like, you're a Christian? Here's all my books on Christianity. Here's all my books on ancient mythology. And so I drove home from his place with 2 extra sets of books. I have all the illuminated manuscripts of Prudentialist, who's mentioned in Christianity and Classical Culture. I have the Golden Bow. I have so many other books I can't really bring myself to read. I have a copy of the Talmud because of him and some other fun stuff. I have 5 different translations of the Art of War because of him. He's a very good guy.
What I take from this is Semi-God gave you the Talmud, and that's the headline for me.
He gave me that. He gave me this collection of Islamic Apocrypha. He gave me a collection of Christian Apocrypha that has all this Gnostic gospel shit. And I'm like, I can't read this. So I have everything more or less. He gave me an extra bookshelf worth of shit that killed my gas mileage coming home, but I'm very thankful for it.
Well, hey, Semi-Gog sounds like a really cool guy.
He is a cool guy. He's a very good friend.
He blocked me.
Oh, that sucks.
So, as an aside, fuck Semi-Agog.
I can't say that to people I've met IRL and have broken bread with, but I understand.
No, I know we need to wrap the 2-hour mark here, so we do need to probably wrap this up soon. There's a couple of paragraphs, a couple of segments here we could get to. If you don't mind, first of all, do you have any closing thoughts or anything that we haven't gotten to that you really want to? Because for me, we got to all the this takes us right to the end of the book.
Oh yeah, opinion. No, we're basically near the very end. There's this section also goes into the different the Pelagian controversy about our reliance on our own logic, or how much of God's help do we need? This question about predeterminism, which later gets referenced a lot during the Reformation. But no, there's this last part here with regards to first principles and sort of what the did you already mention this already? The Logos of Christ thus serves to introduce a new principle of unity and division of human life and human history. Did you mention that earlier?
We mentioned Logos, but I don't know if that was the exact quote.
Well, I'm
'cause-
gonna
go ahead.
Okay. So the Logos of Christ thus serves to introduce a new principle of unity and of division into human life and human history. The unity in question is not merely physical, a unity of the flesh, whether conceived as the matter which enters into our constitution or as the processes to which that matter is subjected to what we call organic life. Nor yet, on the other hand, is it merely mental, depending upon a world of timeless and immaterial patterns. It is in fact a unity of nature, the nature of being created in the divine image and predestined to fulfill the divine will. Human values are therefore not Greek, Roman, or Jew, for German or Celt or European or for Asiatic, but for man as a man. In this conclusion, Christianity reinforces and gives fresh meaning to the classical Stoic intimation of human brotherhood. At the same time, it provides a new sanction, for it is in the Logos of Christ. The new principle of unity serves at the same time as a principle of division among men. For if the true basis of unity lies in nature, the nature of the old Adam before the fall, or the new Adam in whom the demands of the flesh are subordinated to those in the spirit, thus it follows that division must be ascribed to some defect or perversion of nature. Unity rests on the assumption that there is one world, one nature, and one destiny for mankind. To deny that assumption is to introduce into human life a fatal cleavage or heresy from which, apart from divine grace, there is no possibility of escape. This, however, is precisely what occurs when he says, quote, "The will turns aside from good, which is incommunicable and in common, in order to pursue a good which is private or external or inferior," end quote. That is to say, it develops a consequence of what is called the effort of self-realization, where the self to be realized is envisaged as in opposition to God and his universe. In human history, the new principle of unity and division finds its expression in two societies that may be described mystically as two cities. Sorry, these societies are at every point in sharp contrast. There is the city of Christ and the other of the devil, the one of good and the other of evil, both composed of angels as well as men. This vast generalization serves to comprehend the whole human race, all numerous people scattered throughout the earth, living by diverse rites and customs, distinguished by the utmost variety of languages, arms, and clothing. It comprehends also the whole of human history. The life of these two societies extends from the beginning of the race to the end of time, to which they are mixed physically but separated morally, and on the day of judgment to be separated physically as well. They are secular society and the society of God. The point of divergence between these two forms of association are found in their respective desires. Citing the City of God, books 19. That which animates secular society is the love of the self to the point of contempt for God. That which animates divine society is to love God to the point of contempt for the self. The one prides itself on itself, the pride of the other is in the Lord, the one that seeks the glory for men, and the other counts its consciousness of God as its greatest glory. These desires that may therefore be described respectively as greed and of love. The one is holy, the other is foul, the one social, the other selfish, the one thinks of the common advantage for the sake of higher association, the other reduces the common good to the possession of its own sake for self-ascendancy. That one is subject to, the other to a rival of God. One is peaceful, the other turbulent. One is pacific, the other is factious. One prefers truth, one praises the foolish. The other is greedy of the praise of any terms. One is friendly, the other is envious. The one desires the same for his neighbor as for himself, and the other subjects his neighbor to himself. The one governs his neighbor in his neighbor's interest, and the other to his own. And that's the big difference, I think, that you'll see here when looking at the society in which Augustine looks at the world now, is that there is this great divide that can be echoed back to, both the Old Testament or even the earliest works like the Didache. There's a path of life or a path of light, a path of darkness, a path of death, which seeks to constitute, well, what is good and what is bad. Which, of course, this can be taken and generalized to such a degree that it ignores basic differences between peoples. And this is where you see a lot of Christian normie types that kind of get really uncomfortable with human biodiversity, despite the fact that Augustine in other books, and including Inside the City of God, acknowledges that the differences between races and people are very real. So does St. Ambrose, and so do others. I think someone had put out on Dissident Review a lengthy treatise on all Christian fathers and doctors of churches who had commented on diversity of thought. But for Augustine, he's looking at this more metaphysically, not just the HBD stuff. It's more of that now that we've come to this factor that there is a beginning, there is a middle, that there is an end, that there are two paths to take during this time frame from now until the end, and referencing John's Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, that, we will be physically separated, not by race, not by whatever, but did you live a path of good or did you live the path of evil?
But I think that is the root of what you might call runaway separation that we experience now. But I think there was someone earlier, might have been Fabian Cartouche, or one of the guys who writes, sometimes they seem like they're comments from another stream just dropped in here, but they're still good. But it was about segmentation.
It's being streamed in like 4 different places: your Twitter, my YouTube, your YouTube.
Yeah, and even McLuhan talked about the transition from time as the temporal dimension you inhabit to measuring time, to then time becoming a container of action as value. So everything is segmented and there's value assigned to it. But even tracing this back, as you were just saying, there's a segmentation of not everything is fluid. Everything is compartmentalized. There's, as we said in the first part of this, there is an apprehension of this idea of the one. And this coincides with the conceptualization of linear time. Things are actually made more logical. They're made more limited and more literal. They're made less foggy. And you can place yourself in a much more literal place. And there is good and there is evil. It's not gradients. There's a pure good and a pure evil, which sounds like a reductive idea, but I think it's simpler. I think it's 2 atomic bombs going off at the same time, but the simplicity of it is what's revolutionary. That there's the idea of like a pure evil and not just sort of a vague malevolent force that can be bargained with, but something like an existential cancer that must be fought against. I think that's everything became more segmented, more clear, more lines were clearly drawn, and you can tell what side you end up on. And I think that was one of the many aspects that made this more engaging to people. I just wanted to build on that with this segment here. And it says, in this brief and imperfect sketch, we have sought to comprehend the elements of a position which was developed in great detail during many years of stormy controversy. But enough has been said to indicate that, in all essential respects, it marks a radical departure from classical ways of thought. To the classical precept, remember to think of yourself as a mere man, it opposed the promise of deification of humanity. And while classicism rejected the possibility of apotheosis, except for the hero or the Superman, this possibility was now extended to all who believed in Christ. For the one, such apotheosis depended upon the possession of inherent virtue. For the other, it was to be accomplished not through the development of intrinsic qualities of surpassing excellence, but the submission to a law superior to that of nature. And that's circling back to what we spent a lot of time discussing in the first part of this. And just to build on that one little bit more, let me skip ahead to page 418 here. It's on the page here. The error of classicism was in this respect original. It could indeed be traced to the world of naive experience revealed by Homer and the poets. The world to which Homer introduces his reader is a world of movement, in which impressions succeed one another with lightning rapidity. This is a segment I like from the book. This is pretty controversial, what he says. I know quite a few people who disagree with what he's saying with right here, but I wanted to say it anyway. Against this background emerges the figure of man, face to face with a mysterious universe, which his riotous imagination peoples with demonic forces, while at the same time his reason struggles vigorously to reduce those forces to some kind of order. To this endeavor, he is impelled by a conviction that on his power to overcome the obstacles which confront him depends his lot or destiny, and therefore the possibility of achieving the heroic ideal, the conquest by virtue of chance or necessity. So it's saying how important chance or a destiny that is not up to him, how significant that was in the story. Already in the Odyssey, however, the optimism which the Iliad appears to justify becomes somewhat remote, and as the vision of triumph to be achieved through wit and endurance, the main ingredients of virtue fades from the screen. Thus arises a further, more energetic, and at the same time, more conscious and deliberate search for a principle of understanding. So, now a lot of people who are very into both the Iliad and the Odyssey who might disagree with juxtaposing them like that. But I like that idea, and I quoted this in a Vanguard's Journal piece not long ago, showing sort of the transition of the role of the hero or the role of man in the world between the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I'm just looking at, okay, we're talking about melanin in the chat again. Okay. I was worried for a second that people were talking about what we were discussing.
We're so back. Chat has reverted the eternal return. There we go.
All right. So
we're back, kids. We're back.
Yeah, this is near the end of the book. He's kind of summarizing what we were discussing the entire time. So I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Because really in the first part of this, we kind of gave the beginning, middle, and end of everything this book seeks to accomplish. Here in this part, we've gone into a lot more detail into the history of it, and I think got deeper into the philosophy, the revolution of philosophy of the time. So overall, did you have any closing thoughts about Christianity and classical culture? Because I think this is as impressive a book as I can imagine, because I find that Charles Cochrane, if you're reading this, you don't know anything about Cochrane, you don't know where he lands on spirituality. You don't know. I mean, you can probably figure out, but he doesn't. It's not condemning Hellenism or paganism. It wasn't significantly biased, except in perhaps some of its historical accounting. But I found it treated this process not even as a victory. Because they'll say, oh, how did Christianity triumph over paganism? How did it win? Which would imply they're losers. And I don't see that narrative in here.
No, I don't. Although he was a historian, and he was actually an influence on George Grant, who I know is a quite famous social critic from Canada. Cochrane's Canadian, so no coincidences or anything. I just think that it's interesting that we cover so many Canadian writers.
Yeah, I learned that later, and I keep stumbling across them. Canada has a very interesting academic history, especially in psychology and psychoanalysis too. Yeah,
and in fact, he was described by Harold Innis, one of our favorite Canadian academics, and an influence on McLuhan, but Harold Innis described Cochrane as the first major Canadian contribution to the intellectual history of the West. But no, overall, I think that this is a really interesting book, and that you're trying to examine, and I know that he's not the only person to do it, but I think this is one of the, we're always telling you to read old books or books that a lot of people don't talk about. This text really does a good job at sort of contrasting the metaphysical and political theology of the pre-Christian Roman world, and then understanding how Christianity comes to fill a void in the midst of Christianity not getting snuffed out. It doesn't do, while Gibbon gets cited, this book doesn't throw any blame towards the Christians. It doesn't throw any blame towards anyone. It gives a pretty even-handed account of Christian as well as pagan responses to one another. Yes, there were persecutions for both sides at varying times. And that at the same time, it doesn't dive into church tradition in any way that's going to maybe bias you if you're perhaps a secular or a non-believing reader of this kind of stuff. And that it's really well worth your time. And it's also the bibliography of this book is really thick. And if you wanted to get some firsthand primary sources, he has no problem citing the Latin and the Greek to you. So it's pretty good stuff. I would really recommend reading this book for yourself.
Sorry, I was muted there for a second. Mark Trouble says we should check out Northrop Frye. Have you read anything by him before?
Northrop Frye? No, I can't say that I have.
I know the name, and
He's
I'm trying to
a
figure out.
Canadian literary critic.
like, did I hear that because the guy, or did some fucker on X adopt his name and do like an ironic, like Northrop with fries, some shit. You know what I mean? Some shit.
That would be funny. Northrop gunman with fries. That's a very American thing. What did he write about? Now I'm just looking at this. The Anatomy of Criticism. Oh my gosh, I own that book because Semyaga gave it to me.
Well, I guess we're gonna discuss when I Semyaga next soon, I guess.
No, I haven't read anything by him. I know, but I own that book though, because he told me that all people who read books should read stuff on criticism. The Secular Scripture, the Study of the Structure of Romance, collection of essays.
I really feel like we need to take a step away from Canadians for a second.
Yeah, we should maybe find some German shit or Russian shit to get into. Well, we've already covered the Russians already on here. Let's find something really obtuse. Let's go find some French guy.
We got some weird stuff coming up.
We do actually.
Nothing like Spinal Catastrophism or Cyclonopedia. If anyone has anything like that, we'll entertain it.
We'll entertain. I still want to read his new book.
Nick
Moynihan's new book.
Oh, Moynihan's. Oh, fuck yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he's got that one on human extinction.
It sounds like he just wrote a normal book, which is disappointing because that just sounds like something that regular people could read and enjoy, which is not what I'm interested in. I want more spines. I want more demon oil. I need
spine insufficiently catastrophized.
Give me something. What is the Canadian answer to that horse hockey? You know what I mean? We'll find something else. People send me shit all the time. We got one book that I'm building up to, and I don't want it to be a 3-parter, but it might be. But it's The Transformation of the World by Osterhammel. That's like fucking 1,500 pages or something like that. But I know people who've just lost themselves in that too. It's really interesting. But yeah, we got some cool stuff coming up. I'm very happy with
I get lost myself when I read various restaurant reviews that people post on the timeline. Like, I'm sorry, man, if you thought you can't convince me that Ethiopian food is good, because if it was good, then why are they starving all the time?
That's true. Ethiopian food is a meme food, and it has been for most of my adult life. I've heard people back in my 20s saying Ethiopian food's delicious, and you look at it and it's not. It can't be. There's no way that it is. I can tell from looking at it what the flavor profile is, and it's loud. It insists upon itself. But conversely, there's a bit of discourse circulating right now that I'm none too pleased with. Some people just figured out about boil bags. You ever seen this?
Yes. I saw the American Sun tweet go viral.
Yeah, it's like, it's just Zog, like everything's Zog's. Anything you just found out about Zog's.
What did he tweet out? What's wrong, honey? You've hardly touched your Zog boiled slop bag.
Boiled bags are fucking
1.2 million views. That's
like, sometimes I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I don't know what I'm doing online. Have you ever just been so wrong that you went viral with 3 million fucking views?
Yes. Yeah. No, I did that dumbass for a decline for Americans. Imagine a depressed burger, and I had that green text up behind the changes in McDonald's architecture from like 20 years ago to today.
Yeah.
3.5 million views. I'm so tired of existing. The only thing, I'm not going to lie, I understand accounts like Surf now and all those other slop posters. I understand it now because the Twitter payout was amazing. But I'm like, this is not healthy.
Well, also, like, I understand.
Slot pays, kids. This, not so much. Send us your money in a manual typewriter now.
Fucking cold head old troons like me are like, it's just slop. Anyone can do slop. Well, why don't I do it? Why doesn't everyone do it? It's not easy. Like, if I can try and post slop right now, it's gonna get 5 views. I don't got it. I don't got the mojo to pull this shit off. Like, if I could make money being retarded, I would. I do it for free. And who couldn't use 15K for just typing something that gets people mad? I've been making people mad for so long, but I've made $0 with it. So good for them.
I'm no longer asking.
I love that gun. That's such a good idea.
I might get me in trouble one of these days.
They could just say it's like an airsoft gun. It just
Yeah,
sounds like
they don't know what that is. They won't find out until the fucking 40 ACP goes through my mouth.
oh, a Hazel Monster Energy Moonshine. I just wanted to call attention to that. That's just a good sequence of words right there.
So I worked with a buddy of mine for like 4 months, pestering him. Because I was like, dude, why don't I just have like nicotine infused ice cream? And he's like, that is the easiest way to like put someone into the hospital for nicotine poisoning. And I've never been more depressed of trying to create like a liquid infused nicotine sort of like drink or ice cream.
He's
Or
like,
something.
you're the guy who's like, why don't we have like 100% alcohol? Why is it? What do you do? Like drinking like 7%? What if it's 100%? That thought's crossed my mind back when I was drinking. Like, did they ever? People are fucking dumb, yo. Why don't we? Just
Maybe
do
the
100%?
Aborigines are up to something when they sniff gasoline. They're just like, what if we had 100 proof?
Well, here's the thing. Everyone's like, oh, they never had a written language. Maybe being drunk at that level is so good you don't need a language. Like, why do you need to write when you're that wasted? That's what we should be asking ourselves. And we're over here. Oh, here's a new type of rocket. I found a new type of form. We're inventing little tiny robots that can make infinite energy. Or you can be drunk all the time. Which way, Western man?
Which way, Western man? The society that's perpetually wasted, or the society that invents dick pills at the gas station?
Vulpus Persona, put $10 behind this one. Be the crock in the slop pit you want to see. That's what I was saying.
So true.
Boil bags are good. I don't need to defend myself on this one. But if there's one criticism behind it, what is a boil bag, by the way? So you take a bunch of seafood. You're talking your crawfish, crab, mussels, whatever it might be. You put it in a plastic bag. It's like a, quick and dirty, what's it fucking called? Sous vide.
Great question.
It's like a sous vide. So if anyone knows a sous vide, it's basically you put food in sort of a plastic container and then you steam it in the container so it cooks within its own juices. You can do really interesting food this way. You can do eggs this way and they come out a sort of a perfect temperature. I know some people who go crazy with it and only sous vide all their food. You can actually do steak pretty well in this. Anyway, point is that you cook it in its own juices. So you put all the seafood in there with sauces, with garlic butter, with everything, and then it just heats it all together, loses none of the flavor. You dump it out, you have it with rice. And all that sauce then infuses with that great seafood flavor. And I mean, like I go buy that sauce on its own. It's so good. And anyway, it hit the timeline. People are like, what the fuck is this? It's because you ain't living yet. You throw some potatoes and corn in there. You're having a great time. I used to go to these places all the time in Toronto. Yes, it's popular with black people. Yes, if you go to these restaurants, there's going to be loads of black people. You eat it with a bib, by the way. This is a bib type meal.
This is baby shit.
It's good. It's nice. It's good.
You will goo goo gaga over this.
Yeah, I'm gonna take you to a boil bag when we meet. I got a list of shit I'm doing with Prude when we meet up. First of all,
I can't wait for a live Dyer episode, and then it's just like, here's your boil in a bag dinner.
We're eating this. He's gonna put a gun against my head the whole time. We're like, I love living in a meme. I love living in a bit.
Oh, it'll be fun. We should do a live show though in person.
No, we're going to. I'm working out the details of what that would look like. To the point where I'm trying to think of like a location. I'm like, okay, what's in between? Like, what's a place that makes sense between the both of us, or a metropolitan area where we could like get people to go to? And maybe it's at a fucking another
Kansas
conference.
City, I don't know.
It's either like on its own or it's like in and around another conference.
Well, I
or
should
something
probably
like
just renew my passport because I'm eventually going to go on my honeymoon. So I should just have an excuse to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go to Canada and do whatever.
that. Hey honey, let's go.
Hey honey, let's go to Canada for our.
Do you want to go to Toronto?
I've suggested places that I've wanted to visit before already, and she's just like, you just want to go there because you want to go there. And I'm like, yeah, but it's still a European vacation. Why don't you just like shut the fuck up?
Well, that's also such a girl thing to say. No slight against your wife, but when you marry a woman, you kind of marry all women. And it's like, you just want to go there because you want to go there. Yeah, and you want to go where you want to go because you want to go there. What type of statement is that? Think for a fucking minute. Do you ever try thinking?
You didn't think that one through, did you?
Like, you know what? Being married, and you'll get to this point after a long enough time, you really identify with Jack Torrance when he's chasing Wendy up the stairs in The Shining. He's like, "Honey, Wendy, baby, light of my life," and she's swinging the bat at him. And here's the older you get, the less The Shining seems like a horror movie, and more seems just like, I get it, man. Like,
man snaps, and the audience is like, this is the thing that kills me. It's just like, my future brother-in-law is very much a fan of Ryan Gosling films, and he's just like, so true, sex freakman, so true. Prude threatens Dimes with his firearm, while Dimes threatens Prude with sending his Type 2 turbo AIDS and metastasis. But so he's like a big Ryan Gosling fan, or like the whole literally me memeplex. And I'm like, that's something women actually just don't get. I'm going to boil you in a bag, Dimes.
Sure.
I'm gonna no. That's the real definition of money laundering.
Oh no.
Dimes in a bag.
Oh no, one of my friends is gonna end this hellish facade once and for all.
I finally get to escape. Escape my boring ass life. Yeah. Okay.
Oh
cool.
No! The cold embrace of darkness.
Make sure that you aim for the cerebellum. That way, it's ended permanently.
Just a guy being boiled alive and trying to stifle a smile.
just doing the fucking Terminator thumbs up into the like lava, as he goes.
A guy being cannibalized by a tribe. It's Green Inferno.
Oh, the Rockefeller story.
Getting getting vivisected and just going, And
they're like, "Sir, we've cut you in half. Listen, man, it's been a long day. I got a lot going on."
Just some Papua New Guinean with blood and shit and white on his face going, sir?
Sir?
We've actually bone tomahawked you. Actually, gesturing to the glasses it's not wearing. A guy who doesn't know how to fucking make mouth sounds properly. It's fucking...
Actually, this is supposed to be really painful. I think this is the sweet release.
A lot of people wait for the end of the episode, just turbulence and tailspin. We're just like...
you're here to crash out, chat. We know what you want. You're not here to read. That's what we're here to do. You're here to watch us coal out at the end.
Let's see, Sex Freedman, St. Lawrence's Martyrdom, the Netflix adaptation. Sean Milan says,
I do love that story though. Turn me over so I may be well prepared for the Lord.
Willie McDuff says The Shining was designed to make American white women afraid of their husbands. Good. Maybe we could use a bit more of that.
Honey.
And here's why that's a good thing. Cool dude. Hello, chat. Cool dude reporting in. Fashionably late. That's what I like to see from a cool dude.
That is a cool dude. He's fashionably late, but he's not too tardy. I had a super chat come in that just said disaster cycle, and I don't remember what that's in reference to unless there's a book.
It might have just been describing, because we were talking about the Kali Yugas and cyclical time.
Oh, yeah. That may have been the case. Although if someone pays us to review a book, I won't say no.
Yeah, we won't say no to hundreds of dollars.
That's absolutely true.
If you hand me $300, I'll say thank you. I'm very, very tired, so I'm gonna get going.
All right, let's go ahead and end this before this gets worse.
This has been an amazing stream as always. I had a great time. Thank you everyone for taking the time. Great time had by all, and I'll see you guys next time.